She had exactly $1.43 left in the world. Not in her wallet, not in her account. In the world. The baby against her chest hadn't stopped crying for 20 minutes. The cashier behind the counter had already looked at her twice. That look. The one that strips a person down to nothing without saying a single word. And the man in the expensive coat sitting by the window was watching too. Clara Whitmore was 30 years old, and she was about to be humiliated in front of strangers for trying to buy a single piece of old bread. If you've ever felt invisible when the world looked right through you, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. The alarm on Clara Whitmore's phone didn't so much wake her as confirm she had never really slept. 4:47 a.m. She lay there for a moment on the narrow mattress, the one she'd dragged from a curb on Wicker Park 2 years ago, the one with the spring that poked through on the left side if you rolled over wrong, and she stared at the water stain on the ceiling above her that had slowly grown from the size of a quarter to something that now resembled the outline of a hand reaching downward. She'd stopped trying to find meaning in things like that. Meaning was a luxury. Sophie was still asleep. Clara could hear her daughter's soft, uneven breathing from the second-hand crib wedged between the dresser and the wall, close enough that Clara could reach out and touch her without standing up. That had been intentional. When you live in a studio apartment in one of Chicago's cheaper zip codes, and your upstairs neighbor runs what sounds like a small demolition operation every Friday night, and the heat in the building cuts out randomly throughout November, you keep your baby close. She made herself get up before she could talk herself out of it. The floor was cold. She hadn't owned slippers since the summer before Sophie was born, when she'd still had a real paycheck, a real apartment, and the naive belief that her boyfriend Marcus would stay when things got hard. He hadn't. He'd left 3 weeks after Sophie's birth with a duffel bag and a voicemail explaining that he wasn't in a place to be a father. Clara had listened to that voicemail 4 times in one night, trying to find the part where it made sense. Then she'd deleted it and never thought about him again. That was the story she told herself anyway. She moved quietly through the apartment, all 400 square feet of it, and started the coffee maker that she'd bought at a garage sale for $3. It worked, technically, if you understood that worked meant it produced something hot and brown that tasted approximately like coffee. She stood over the small kitchen counter, and while the machine coughed and sputtered, she opened the Notepad app on her phone and looked at her schedule. Monday, 5:30 a.m. to 9 a.m. Cleaning shift, Meridian Office Complex, West Loop, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Checkout cashier, Fresh Mart on Division, 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. Waitress, Lenny's Diner, Bucktown. Between the second and third job, she had exactly 2 hours. In those 2 hours, she needed to take the 72 bus to Mrs. Okonkwo's apartment, drop Sophie off, ride back, change out of her Fresh Mart polo, eat something if there was something to eat, and get to Lenny's before 4 p.m. She'd been running the schedule, or something close to it, for 14 months. The coffee finished. She poured it into a chipped mug that said Chicago Marathon 2019, something left behind by a previous tenant, and she sat on the edge of the mattress and drank it slowly, watching Sophie sleep. Her daughter was beautiful in the way that all babies are beautiful, and also specifically heartbreakingly beautiful in a way that only belonged to Sophie. She had her grandmother's forehead, wide and smooth, and she slept with both fists pressed against her cheeks, like she was bracing herself for something. Even unconscious, Sophie Whitmore looked like she was fighting. Clara felt the familiar tightening in her chest. I'm going to do better, she thought. I'm going to figure this out. She'd thought that thought almost every morning for 14 months. Some days it felt like a promise. Most days it felt like something she said to fill the silence. She almost didn't notice the state of her wallet until she was on the bus to the West Loop. Standing in the crush of morning commuters, Sophie bundled against her in the carrier she'd stitched back together with a safety pin after the buckle broke. She'd reached into her coat pocket to check her transit card balance. The CTA app always made her anxious in November when the cold made everything slower, and her fingers had brushed against the thin leather fold of her wallet. She pulled it out. $1 bill, folded in half. 3/4. A dime. 8 pennies. $1.43. She stood there as the bus lurched forward and strangers pressed against her on both sides, and she did the math that she already knew. Her next paycheck from the cleaning company wasn't until Thursday. Fresh Mart paid bi-weekly, which meant not until next Monday. Lenny's paid in cash at the end of each shift, which was the reason she'd taken the job. But after last night's slow Monday service, her tips had been $11, and she'd already used 9 of that this morning to pay Mrs. Okonkwo for 2 days of childcare in advance, because Mrs. Okonkwo had been patient long enough. $1.43. She had food at home, a third of a box of pasta, 4 eggs, 1 can of diced tomatoes, and a half-empty jar of peanut butter. That would feed her through tomorrow night if she was careful. But Sophie was almost out of formula, and the specific formula, the sensitive stomach one that didn't make her cry for hours afterward, cost $14 for the small can. She didn't have $14. She had to get through today, get through her shifts, collect her cash from Lenny's tonight, and then buy formula tomorrow morning. Sophie would be hungry before tonight. Clara pressed her face briefly against the top of her daughter's head and inhaled. "We're okay," she whispered, not sure who she was saying it to. The Meridian office complex cleaning shift was exactly the kind of work that hollowed you out. Not because it was particularly hard, but because it was perfectly invisible. You arrived before the building woke up. You moved through the hallways and offices with a cart and a mop and a collection of sprays and cloths, and you cleaned the surfaces where important people would soon sit and make important decisions, and you left before any of them arrived. Sometimes you found things: a forgotten phone, a $20 bill under a desk chair once, an earring that probably cost more than Clara's monthly rent, and you put them in the lost and found box by the security desk, and you went home and you didn't think about it. Clara had been working this shift for 8 months. She knew the building's rhythms the way you know a place you've never truly been welcomed in. She knew that the 4th floor men's bathroom always needed extra attention on Monday mornings. She knew that the executive kitchen on 6 had a coffee machine that the staff never cleaned properly. She knew that the cleaning cart's left front wheel stuck when you turned it too sharply to the right. She knew all of this. She knew none of the people. That was fine. She wasn't there to be known. By the time she finished the 3rd floor and started loading the cart back into the supply closet, her lower back had begun its usual protest. She'd been on her feet for 3.5 hours. Sophie had been dropped at Mrs. Okonkwo's with the last of the formula, just enough for 1 feeding. And Clara had a 2-hour window before the Fresh Mart shift, and her body was already running the numbers. She leaned against the supply closet door frame for exactly 30 seconds. She allowed herself 30 seconds. Then she straightened up and kept moving. In the elevator down, she caught a reflection in the mirrored doors. She looked older than 30. That was the first thought, and it came without self-pity, just observation, the way you'd observe the weather. Her hair, which had once been one of those things people complimented her on, thick and dark and long, was pulled back in a ponytail so tight it gave her a low-grade headache. There were shadows under her eyes that good sleep probably couldn't fix at this point. They'd been there too long. Her coat was a dark green pea coat that she'd bought for $19 from a Goodwill in Logan Square. And it was nice enough, but there was a small tear along the left collar that she'd been meaning to fix for 3 months. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that a good night's sleep fixes. The other kind. The kind that settles into your bones over years and starts to feel like your natural state. The elevator opened. She walked through the lobby. The security guard at the desk, Gerald, a heavy-set man in his 50s who always had a thermos of something hot, glanced up and nodded. "Whitmore, cold out there today." "Yeah." She pulled her coat tighter. "Stay warm, Gerald." "You too." Outside, the November air hit her like a physical thing. Chicago in late autumn didn't mess around. It came at you sideways, the wind off the lake cutting through whatever you were wearing and reminding you that the city had been here long before you and had no particular feelings about your comfort. She walked quickly to the bus stop and stood with her shoulders up and her hands shoved deep in her pockets, and she thought about the formula situation and the $1.43 situation, and she thought about how she had 8 credits left before she would have finished her business administration degree. 8 credits she'd been 8 credits away from for 2 years now, and she shut that thought down hard because it led nowhere useful. You dealt with what was in front of you. That was the rule. Go sit. The Fresh Mart shift was easier in the sense that she was sitting down, harder in the sense that she had to smile for 4 hours at people buying things she couldn't afford. Organic chicken breasts, $14 blocks of artisan cheese, wine that cost more per bottle than her weekly grocery budget. She didn't resent them, exactly. She'd learned that resentment was expensive and she couldn't afford it. But she noticed. Around noon, during a slow spell between customers, her manager Kevin, 26 years old, fresh out of community college with an associate's in business management, genuinely decent, but with the kind of clueless confidence that comes from never having had a hard month, swung by her register. "Hey, Clara, you doing okay? You look kind of—" "I'm good," she said, before he could finish the sentence. "I was going to say you look tired." "I said I'm good, Kevin." He hesitated. "Okay, just checking." He paused. "Hey, also, there's a scheduling thing. I need someone to cover the Thursday morning shift. It starts at 6 instead of 8. Would you—" "Yes," she said immediately. He blinked. "Don't you want to know how long?" "Yes to whatever it is, Kevin." "It's like a 12-hour shift." "Yes?" He looked at her for a moment with something on his face she couldn't fully read. Something between admiration and pity, which was a combination she'd grown to hate more than outright pity, because at least outright pity was honest. "Okay," he said. "I'll put you down." She rang through a cart of groceries for a woman who was talking on the phone the entire time, never making eye contact, never saying thank you, and Clara scanned each item with the same neutral expression she'd perfected over months, the expression that meant nothing, that gave nothing away, that kept her invisible in exactly the way the situation required. That was her skill, she'd realized. Not her unfinished business degree, not her 3 jobs. Her real skill was being invisible when the world needed her to be invisible, and present when Sophie needed her to be present, and somehow managing to toggle between the 2 states without losing the thread that connected them. She was very tired. But Sophie's face in the morning, those fists pressed against her cheeks, that soft, uneven breathing, pulled the thread taut again every single time. By 3 in the afternoon, Clara had 45 minutes before she needed to be heading toward Lenny's. She was on a stretch of River Street she didn't usually walk, having taken a slightly longer route from the bus stop, because the wind on Michigan Avenue was genuinely unbearable today, and this side street was at least partially sheltered. Sophie was with Mrs. Okonkwo until 7. Clara's feet hurt. Her back hurt. She was experiencing the specific kind of hunger that comes from skipping breakfast, and having a lunch that consisted of a pack of crackers she'd brought from home and eaten standing over a trash can outside Freshmart. She almost walked past the café. It was called, according to the small hand-lettered sign in the window, The Bend, as in the bend in the river 2 blocks north. It was narrow and warm-looking, with wooden tables visible through the fogged-up glass and a chalk menu board she could read from outside. The kind of place that had been there for decades before the neighborhood started changing. The kind of place that looked like it didn't care about being trendy and had been proved right. She stopped. Not because she planned to go in. She knew what things cost in places like that. But Sophie had barely eaten. The formula had run low, and Clara had a sudden desperate wave of hunger so acute it made her actually dizzy for a moment, one hand going out to steady herself against the building. She stood there for a second, then she pushed open the door. The warmth hit her immediately. The smell of coffee and something baking, cinnamon maybe, something sweet and warm, and the low murmur of conversations and soft music from a speaker she couldn't see. About a dozen people inside, mostly working on laptops, a few in pairs. The counter along the back wall with a glass display case. She went to the case first, the way you check the prices before you commit to anything. Her eyes found what she was looking for almost immediately, a small sign at the end of the case. Day-old bread, single slice, $1. She had $1. She almost laughed. She almost actually laughed, standing in a cafe in Chicago in November, because she had exactly the amount of money required to buy the cheapest possible item and not a cent more, which was somehow the most perfect summary of her life at this exact moment. She got in line. There were 2 people ahead of her, both ordering real things, lattes and sandwiches, and Clara stood with Sophie bundled against her chest in the carrier, one hand pressed to her daughter's back, feeling the small, warm weight of her. And she looked at the day-old bread in the case and told herself this was fine. She'd get a slice of bread, she'd sit down for 10 minutes to rest her feet, and then she'd go to Lenny's and get through the dinner shift and collect her cash. And tomorrow she'd buy the formula and they would be fine. Sophie chose this moment to start crying. Not fussing. Crying. The full-throated, nothing is okay cry that all babies have in their arsenal and that cuts through every social setting like a knife through paper. Every head in the cafe turned, the involuntary response, and Clara felt the heat rise to her face immediately. Hey, hey, shh! She bounced slightly, pressing her lips to Sophie's head. Shh! Baby, we're okay, we're okay. Sophie did not appear to share her assessment. The couple ahead of her moved aside with their order, and Clara stepped up to the counter. The cashier was young, 20 maybe, with a nose ring and an expression that was professionally neutral. Hi, Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Can I get the day-old bread, please? Just the single slice? She put her dollar on the counter. She fished the quarters and the dime and the 8 pennies out of her pocket and put them beside it. That'll be $1, the cashier said, glancing at Sophie, who was still crying. Right. Clara pushed the dollar forward. That's the dollar. Sorry, I just... Are you sure you don't want something else? We have just the bread. Clara kept her voice even. Please. She was aware of the cafe behind her. She was aware, in that horrible, specific way, of the silence that had fallen in the nearest cluster of tables. She was aware of being looked at, not with cruelty, necessarily, but with that particular species of discomfort that people feel when they're witnessing something they'd rather not witness, something that makes them grateful and guilty in equal measure. She kept her eyes forward. The cashier reached for the bread. Hey, the voice came from somewhere to her left. Quiet. Not loud enough to be performed, not the voice of someone making a point, just a regular voice, directed at her. Clara turned. He was sitting alone at a corner table near the window, the kind of table you chose when you wanted to work without being disturbed, with a laptop open and a coffee going cold beside it and a yellow legal pad covered in handwritten notes. He was wearing a navy coat that Clara could tell, even from across the room, cost more than a month of her rent. Not flashy. Not the kind of expensive that announces itself. The kind of expensive that just is, quietly, without effort. The way certain people carry wealth like it's their actual skin. He was maybe 30, 32, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had lines in it that were too deep for his age, the lines that come from going through something rather than from time. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity, not the guilty, grateful look from the other tables. Something more direct than that, more even. Come sit down, he said. Clara stared at him. Excuse me? Come sit down. He nodded at the empty chair across from him. I was about to order something anyway. Come eat something real. She didn't move. I don't need... She started. I know you don't need anything. His tone didn't change. Still quiet, still even, no particular urgency to it. I'm not suggesting you do. I'm saying come sit down. I don't know you. No, he agreed. You don't. Sophie was still crying, softer now, worn down from the effort. Clara was holding the bread the cashier had given her, and she was standing in the middle of a cafe in front of a stranger who had the particular unnerving quality of seeming genuinely indifferent to how she responded, like he'd made the offer and was fine either way. Every instinct she had said, don't. She'd learned over the last 4 years of her life what men with money wanted when they offered something. It was never what they said it was. There was always a ledger somewhere, and sooner or later you found out what you owed. She knew this. She stood there for a moment longer. Sophie made a small, exhausted sound against her chest. Clara walked to the table and sat down. Usun. Ethan, he said, and extended his hand across the table. She shook it. Clara. He nodded. He didn't make a thing of it. No big smile, no performed warmth. He just signaled to the server, a different one from the counter, an older woman with gray braids, and said, Can we get 2 of the soup, the good bread, and whatever she wants to drink? And he glanced at Sophie, who had quieted to a damp, exhausted snuffle. Do you have anything like warm milk, or... She's on formula, Clara said automatically. Then, because it felt like information she hadn't meant to give, she's fine. Okay. He looked at the server. Just the soup and bread then. Coffee for me and... He looked at Clara. Water's fine. Hot tea, he said to the server. The server left. Clara looked across the table at this man, Ethan, who had just ordered hot tea for her when she'd said water, and she tried to figure out what she was doing here. I don't want anything from you, she said, in case that needs to be said. It doesn't. I just want to make sure. I know. He leaned back slightly in his chair, not defensive, not offended. I'm not going to pretend I didn't notice what just happened over there. You were about to leave without eating. I noticed. I said something. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. That's it. That's it. That's it. She watched him for a moment. He had picked up his pen again and was looking at something on the legal pad, not at her, giving her space she hadn't asked for but apparently needed. Sophie shifted against her chest, making a soft, groggy sound, the post-cry exhaustion settling in. Why? Clara asked. He looked up. Why what? Why notice? Why say something? She gestured slightly, a vague motion that meant all of this. People don't. In this city especially, people don't. He was quiet for a moment, not thinking about what to say, more like the answer was there and he was deciding how much of it to give her. Because someone did it for me once, he said finally, and I didn't die from the embarrassment. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The soup arrived. She hadn't meant to talk to him. She'd meant to eat the soup, which was a thick, smoky tomato bisque with a piece of actual good bread and a pat of real butter, the kind of meal that costs nothing to someone with money and everything to someone without it, and then politely thank him and leave. She had 40 minutes before she needed to start heading to Lenny's. She had her life to get back to. But he asked about Sophie first, not in the cooing, uncomfortable way some strangers asked about babies, but like he was actually curious. How old? 7 months. Does she sleep? Barely. Clara pulled off a small piece of bread and ate it slowly, making herself not devour it too fast. She's getting better. My daughter didn't sleep through the night until she was almost 10 months. He said it matter-of-factly, like it was just information. I thought I was losing my mind. Clara looked up. You have a daughter? Olivia. She's 5 now. She waited for the follow-up, the wife, the nanny, the big house in Lincoln Park. But he didn't offer it, and something about the way he'd said she's 5 now, with a small pause before the now, told her the story was more complicated than the surface. Her mother passed, he said, reading her silence accurately. 3 years ago. I'm sorry. Yeah. He glanced out the window at the November street. It was... He stopped, shook his head slightly. It was a hard stretch. Clara looked down at her soup. Where is she now? Olivia? School. I'll get her at 5. He said it simply, with the comfort of a practiced routine, the way parents talk about pickup times, like an anchor, something that structures the rest of the day around it. She almost said, I pick Sophie up at 7. She didn't. She didn't want to trade information that equalized them in some way she wasn't comfortable with yet. What do you do? She asked instead. The legal pad? The laptop? Real estate development. He said it the same way he said everything. No particular pride in it. Construction projects, mostly. Commercial and some residential. In Chicago? Mostly. Some in the suburbs. We're looking at Milwaukee. She nodded. The soup was very good. She was on her second piece of bread and she felt her body unclenching slightly, the way it did when it finally got what it needed. What about you? He asked. She almost deflected. She almost said 3 jobs and left it at that, the version of the answer that was technically accurate and gave nothing away. But there was something in the way he'd asked, the same evenness, the same absence of performance, that caught her off guard. I was almost done with a business degree, she said. University of Illinois. I had 8 credits left. Had? 2 years ago I had to drop out. Money? Money, and then I found out I was pregnant, and she made a gesture. Life rearranged itself. He was quiet for a moment. 8 credits. About 2 semesters worth of coursework if I took it part-time. She laughed, and it came out with more bitterness than she intended. If I could stop working 3 jobs long enough to take any classes. 3 jobs. Cleaning, cashier, waitress. She looked at him. I have one in 40 minutes, actually, so... 8 credits is nothing, he said. She stopped. Sorry? 8 credits. He said it like he was restating a number in a negotiation, making sure they were both working from the same figure. That's not very much. That's almost done. I know it's almost done. The edge came into her voice before she could stop it. That's what makes it. She stopped herself, pressed her lips together, looked away. The cafe hummed quietly around them. Sophie was asleep against her chest, the perfect, complete unconsciousness of the truly exhausted. I'm not trying to make it sound simple, he said, and he said it in a way that made her believe him, which surprised her. I know it's not simple. I'm just saying that 8 credits is a specific number. Specific numbers have solutions. She looked at him. Why does any of this matter to you? He held her gaze. Because you're sitting in front of me eating soup like you haven't eaten all day, and you have a sleeping baby on your chest, and you're working 3 jobs and you're 8 credits from a degree, and that's a lot. He paused. And because I've been in a version of that position, and someone didn't walk past me. Clara studied him for a long moment. He wasn't performing anything. That was the thing. There was no angle she could identify, no transaction she could see taking shape. He was just here, saying true things in a quiet voice. It terrified her slightly. She was far more comfortable with people who wanted something. At least then you knew the rules. I have to go to work, she said. I know. She started gathering herself, adjusting Sophie's carrier, pulling on her coat, the mechanical process of leaving that she'd done 1,000 times. Clara! She looked up. He had taken a business card from somewhere, not making a show of it, just placing it on the table, face up, pushing it slightly toward her. I'm not asking you to do anything with that, he said. I'm not making a pitch. If you want to throw it away the second you get outside, do it. He glanced down at Sophie, then back at her. But if you're ever in a place where you want to talk about the 8 credits, call. She looked at the card. Ethan Calloway, Calloway Development Group. She picked it up. She didn't say anything. She didn't commit to anything. She put the card in her coat pocket, in the same pocket where she'd had the wallet with the $1.43, which was now empty, because the dollar had paid for the bread she was still holding. Thank you for the soup, she said. Don't thank me for the soup. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She walked out of the bend into the November cold, Sophie warm and sleeping against her chest, and she walked toward the bus stop that would take her to Lenny's Diner, where she would wait tables for 5 hours and smile at strangers and collect cash at the end of the night. And in her coat pocket, pressed against the empty wallet, was a business card from a man she didn't know in a cafe she hadn't meant to enter. She didn't throw it away. Lenny's Diner on a Monday night was not exactly humming. Clara tied on her apron in the back hallway, a narrow, slightly damp corridor that smelled of dish soap and old grease and the particular staleness of a kitchen that had been running for 20 years. And she clocked in at 3:58 p.m., which was 2 minutes early, which was something she always did because being 2 minutes early cost nothing, and being 2 minutes late cost a conversation with Pete, the shift manager, who had the energy of a man who had been mildly disappointed by everything in his life and wanted company. Whitmore, Pete said, not looking up from his clipboard. Section 3, tonight. Benny called in. All of Section 3? He called in, Clara. Section 3 was the large back area of the diner, 8 tables that became 12 if you pulled the folding partition over. On a busy night, running Section 3 alone was an aerobic event. On a slow Monday night, it meant walking a lot of empty tables and counting ceiling tiles. Fine, she said. She went to work. The first 2 hours were quiet. A few regulars. She knew their orders already. The older woman who always got decaf and a bowl of oatmeal regardless of what time it was. The construction crew of 4 who came in every Monday and ordered the same rotation of burgers and fries and ribbed at each other constantly in a mix of English and something she thought might be Polish. She moved between the tables automatically, her body knowing the route, her mind doing the thing it did on slow shifts, running numbers, cash tips from tonight. Formula cost. Bus fare for the rest of the week. Mrs. Okonkwo, who had been patient but whose patience was a finite resource. The 8 credits at U of I, which cost, she'd looked it up quietly, at 1 a.m. 2 months ago when she couldn't sleep, approximately $1,800 per credit hour for in-state students, which meant she needed $14,400 to finish, not counting the cost of living through the time it would take to do it. $14,400. She refilled the coffee for the decaf woman and smiled and thought about how that number had looked on the U of I website at 1 a.m., glowing in the dark of her apartment, Sophie asleep a foot away. It had looked like a joke, a number so large it stopped being real. She pushed it away. Deal with what's in front of you. Around 7, she took her 10-minute break in the back hallway, and she sat on an overturned milk crate, and she pulled out her phone, and she almost took the business card out of her coat pocket and looked at it. She didn't. She ate 3 crackers from the bag in her apron and drank half a cup of water and stared at the wall and thought about Sophie's face in the morning, those fists against her cheeks, bracing for whatever was coming. I'm going to do better, she thought. She went back out to Section 3. By 9 o'clock, she had $43 in tips, which was decent for a Monday, and she stood at the end of the bar while Pete counted out her cash wages for the night, and she felt the specific grinding exhaustion of a day that had started at 4:47 a.m. and was only now ending 17 hours later, with her feet sending strong complaints up through her calves and her lower back in open revolt. She stepped outside. The November air hit her. The city hummed around her, the distant sound of the highway, the closer sound of a bar down the block, the smell of cold concrete and exhaust. Chicago at 9 on a Monday was quiet enough to hear itself think. She put her hands in her pockets. Her fingers found the business card. She held it there for a moment, not looking at it, just feeling the small rectangle of it between her fingers. She thought about the man at the café, his steady voice, his absence of performance, the way he'd said 8 credits is a specific number like it was a problem with a solution. She thought about Marcus's voicemail, which she'd deleted. She thought about the water stain on her ceiling. She thought about $14,400. She thought about Sophie's fists against her cheeks, bracing, always bracing. She took the bus home. She paid Mrs. Okonkwo, who handed over a sleeping Sophie without ceremony. She carried her daughter home on the night bus, one hand supporting her head, feeling the warm weight of her against her shoulder. She put Sophie in the crib. She stood over her for a moment in the dark, full. Then she went to the small table by the window, the one that served as her desk and her kitchen table and the only surface in the apartment that was hers. And she sat down and she put the business card on the table in front of her. She looked at it for a long time. Ethan Calloway. Calloway Development Group. Below the name, a phone number. Below that, an email. She thought about all the reasons not to call. She'd assembled them on the bus ride home, organized them efficiently the way she organized everything out of necessity. He was a stranger. He was wealthy in a way that created its own kind of power imbalance. She didn't do things out of desperation, or she tried not to, because desperation made people sloppy, made them agree to things they shouldn't agree to, made them mistake kindness for safety. She knew all of that. She also knew she had $1.43 at the start of today, and it had become nothing. She also knew she was 8 credits from a degree she'd spent 3 years working toward before life rearranged itself. She also knew, and this was the one that sat heaviest, that Sophie was going to need things Clara couldn't provide on 3 minimum wage jobs, and no sleep, and no future that looked different from this one. She picked up her phone. She typed an email because calling felt like too much, too direct, too committed. An email gave her an exit. An email was less than a bridge. It was more like a note thrown across a gap. Mr. Calloway, this is Clara from the cafe this afternoon. I wanted to thank you for the meal. You said to reach out if I wanted to talk about the 8 credits. I don't know exactly why I'm emailing instead of throwing the card away. Maybe I should have. But I still have 8 credits left, and I'm still not sure what a solution looks like. CW. She read it 3 times. She sent it. Then she closed her phone and lay down on the mattress with the broken spring on the left side. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she fell asleep before she could finish counting the reasons she shouldn't have. The city went quiet outside her window. Somewhere 2 blocks north, the river bent and kept moving. And on a table by a window, in a 4th-floor studio apartment, Clara Whitmore's phone lit up once with a reply. 12 words, nothing more. I'm glad you didn't throw it away. I'll be in touch. The reply had been 12 words. Clara read them again the next morning, standing over the crib while Sophie slept past 6 for the first time in 2 weeks. I'm glad you didn't throw it away. I'll be in touch. She'd read it so many times the night before that the words had stopped looking like words and started looking like a pattern, like something she was trying to decode rather than simply understand. Now, in the gray November light coming through the window that never quite closed all the way, She read it one more time and felt approximately the same thing she'd felt the first time. A complicated mixture of something that wanted to be hope and something that knew better. She put her phone down and started the coffee maker. She told herself she wasn't going to spend the day waiting to hear from a stranger. She had 2 shifts, Freshmart at 10, Lenny's at 4, and she had to get Sophie to Mrs. Okonkwo by 9:30, and the formula situation had been resolved last night by the cash from Lenny's. So today was manageable. Today was just another Tuesday in a long string of Tuesdays. She made it to approximately 11 before she checked her phone again. Nothing. By the time she was halfway through the Freshmart shift, she had decided, with considerable firmness, that the whole thing had been exactly what she'd feared from the start. A wealthy man with a savior impulse who'd acted on it in the moment and moved on by morning. It happened. People offered things they didn't mean. She'd spent years watching people offer things they didn't mean. She was not surprised. She was not disappointed. She was a little disappointed. She scanned a cart full of groceries for a man who smelled like expensive cologne and barely looked up from his phone, and she maintained her neutral expression with the expertise of someone who had long ago made peace with invisibility, and she didn't check her phone again until her 15-minute break at 12:30. There was an email, not from Ethan Calloway, from a woman named Patricia Nguyen, whose email signature identified her as Executive Assistant, Calloway Development Group. The email was brief and professional. Mr. Calloway had asked her to reach out to schedule a meeting at Claire's convenience, either in person at the CDG offices on Wacker Drive or at a location of her choosing, and could she please indicate her availability for later in the week. Clara sat in the break room, a narrow space behind the stock area with 2 plastic chairs and a table that wobbled, and she read the email twice. He had an executive assistant reach out to schedule the meeting. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. It was either the sign of a man so organized he ran everything through proper channels, or it was the sign of a man who wanted a buffer between himself and whatever he'd impulsively started yesterday. She thought about it for the remainder of her break and arrived at no useful conclusion. She typed back, "Thursday afternoon works. I'd prefer somewhere neutral, not your office. Do you know the Bend on River Street?" Patricia Nguyen replied in 11 minutes. "Thursday at 2 p.m. at the Bend. Mr. Calloway will be there. Thank you." Clara put her phone away and went back to her register. She told herself it was just a conversation. She'd had conversations before. Wednesday passed the way Wednesdays did. Full, grinding, the week's midpoint, where the exhaustion had fully set in, but the end wasn't close enough to feel real. She worked the cleaning shift and the Freshmart shift and spent the evening at home with Sophie, who was in a phase of grabbing anything within reach and examining it with profound seriousness, as if every object contained a secret that required careful investigation. Clara sat on the floor with her and they went through a wooden spoon, a plastic bowl, and an empty paper towel roll for about 45 minutes, and it was the best part of the week. She thought about Thursday more than she wanted to admit. She changed her outfit 3 times Thursday morning before landing on the same dark jeans and gray sweater she'd started with, because changing outfits implied she was trying to impress someone and she wasn't. She was going to a meeting. She went to meetings in dark jeans and gray sweaters. That was that. She dropped Sophie at Mrs. Okonkwo's at 1:30. The older woman, who had seen Clara leave for every variation of shift and errand and emergency over the past 14 months, looked her over with the frank assessment of someone who had earned that privilege. "Where are you going?" Mrs. Okonkwo asked. "Meeting." "What kind of meeting?" "A business meeting." Mrs. Okonkwo looked at her for a long moment. She had a way of looking at Clara that conveyed an entire conversation in about 4 seconds. "Take Sophie's extra blanket," she said finally. "It's cold." "I'm not taking Sophie." "I know, it's for you. You never dress warmly enough." She was already turning back inside. "Be back before 7. Clara walked to the bus stop with Mrs. Okonkwo's voice still in her head and the cold air working at her face and her hands shoved in her pockets, and she rehearsed the conversation she intended to have. She was going to listen. She was going to ask direct questions. She was going to trust nothing that didn't come with a clear explanation of what was expected in return. She was going to be polite and firm and composed, and she was not going to be moved by someone being kind to her simply because she hadn't had much of that recently. She was a grown woman. She knew how the world worked. She arrived at the bend 7 minutes early and ordered a water and sat at a table near the middle of the room, not by the window, not the same table as Monday, and she waited. He walked in at exactly 2 o'clock. Bossem. He looked different in daylight. Or maybe she was just looking more carefully this time, now that she'd had 2 days to think about him rather than being ambushed by kindness while standing at a counter with a crying baby. He was taller than she remembered, or the room just felt smaller. He had the same qualities she'd noticed Monday, a kind of containment, like someone who had learned a long time ago not to take up more space than necessary. He spotted her immediately and came over without any of the awkward scanning of the room that most people did. Clara. He sat down across from her. No handshake this time, just the natural ease of someone picking up a conversation that had only briefly been paused. How was your week? It was a week. She folded her hands on the table. Thank you for coming. I suggested it. Your assistant suggested it. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Patricia is very efficient. Clearly. The server came. He ordered coffee, she kept her water, and for a moment the practical business of ordering filled the space between them. Then the server left, and there was nothing between them but the table and whatever she was willing to say. She decided to go first. I want to understand what you're actually offering, she said. I don't know what Monday was, but I'm here now and you've got a meeting with me and I want to know what it looks like from your side. He nodded. No offense taken. No deflection. Okay? Because people who offer things usually want things back, and I need to know what that is before I agree to anything, because I have a 7-month-old and I can't afford to make a bad decision. That's fair. So what do you want? He was quiet for a moment, not defensive, just thinking. I run a company, he said, about 200 employees. We develop commercial and residential properties, but we're mid-sized, not the biggest player in Chicago, but we've been growing consistently for 4 years. He paused. I need good people. People who can think operationally, who understand how systems work, who can handle pressure without falling apart. He looked at her. Monday, you told me you have 8 credits left on a business administration degree. I looked up the U of I curriculum. The courses you need are available online through their continuing education program. Clara stared at him. You looked up my curriculum. I wanted to understand the actual situation before I started talking. She was quiet for a second. Okay. The 8 credits would take you 1 to 2 semesters part-time, depending on how you schedule it. The cost is approximately $14,400, she said flatly. He stopped. You know the number. I looked it up at 1 in the morning 2 months ago. I know the number. Her voice came out with more rawness than she intended, so she tightened it. I know the exact number. I just can't get anywhere close to it working 3 jobs and paying rent. He nodded. I know, which is why I'm proposing something specific, not just... He seemed to search briefly for the word. Not just handing you money and calling it charity. I'm not interested in doing that, and I don't think you'd take it anyway. She didn't confirm or deny that. He wasn't wrong. Here's what I'm thinking, he said. CDG has an operations coordinator position that's been open for 6 weeks. It's entry-level by our standards, but it's real work. Project scheduling, vendor coordination, some client communication. It pays $42,000 a year to start, with benefits. He paused to let that number land. The hours are flexible for the right candidate. I've structured jobs like this before for people who had real-world constraints. Clara did math she hadn't expected to be doing. $42,000 a year was 3 times what she was making now. It was benefits, which she hadn't had since before Sophie. It was flexibility, which was the word that meant the difference between possible and impossible. And the credits? She asked, keeping her voice steady with effort. CDG has a tuition reimbursement program for full-time employees. Covers up to $20,000 per year for job-relevant education. He looked at her. 8 credits at $1,400 per hour is covered. She sat back in her chair. Her chest was doing something complicated. She was aware of it, the thing that happened when something you'd given up on suddenly reappeared in a form you couldn't immediately dismiss. She'd gotten good at shutting that down, the self-protection reflex. But it was harder when the numbers were this specific, when the logic of it was this clean and visible. What's the catch? She asked. There's no catch. There's always a catch. He picked up his coffee. The catch is that it's real work. I'm not offering you a sinecure. The operations coordinator role has deliverables and deadlines and people you'll have to deal with who are not always easy to deal with. You'll be in an office environment you've never worked in before, with people who have more credentials than you and may not let you forget it. He set the cup down. And you'll be doing it while taking online classes and raising a baby. I'm not pretending that's easy. She looked at him. Why me? There are other people, better qualified people. Better qualified on paper. What does that mean? It means I've hired people with MBAs who couldn't think their way out of a logistics problem that you probably solve every day before breakfast. He said it without flattery, just like he was stating something he'd observed. You're managing 3 schedules, a budget, a child, and a housing situation simultaneously. You have a partially completed business degree, and you sent me a very good email. She almost laughed at that. A very good email. Short, honest, no performance. I deal with a lot of performance in my line of work. I notice when it's absent. She looked at the table for a moment. Outside the window, the November street went on being gray and cold and indifferent, the way Chicago streets were. A bus passed. A couple walked by under one umbrella, slightly off sync, getting wetter than they needed to. I'm scared, she said, and then immediately felt exposed for having said it. He didn't jump on it. He didn't tell her it was going to be fine or offer her reassurance she hadn't asked for. He just sat with it for a moment the way someone does when they respect what you've just admitted. I know, he said. I've been burned before by people who offered things. I know that too. And I'm not good at depending on people. I stopped being good at it a while ago. He was quiet. Outside, the bus was gone. The couple under the umbrella had moved on, slightly drier, maybe, or just further down the block and still getting rained on. When my wife died, he said, slowly, like he was choosing each word deliberately, I had a 2-year-old daughter and a company that was 6 months old, and a debt load that would have frightened a bank examiner. And I had people who offered me things that came with catches, and people who offered things sincerely and then couldn't follow through, and eventually I started just... He stopped. You build walls. You get efficient at not needing anyone. It feels like strength for a while. And then? And then you realize you've built something you can't get out of. She held his gaze. It was the first time he'd said something that wasn't functional, wasn't about numbers or schedules or what was on offer. It was the first time he'd given her something from whatever was actually behind the even voice and the steady eyes. She didn't know what to do with it entirely, but she didn't look away. If I took this, she said carefully, and it didn't work out, if I couldn't manage the workload or the credits or something went wrong with Sophie, then it didn't work out, he said. You'd still have the credits you'd completed. You'd still have the experience on your resume. Nothing I'm offering takes something from you if it falls apart. And the childcare? You mentioned childcare support Monday. What does that mean specifically? He pulled out the legal pad. She noticed he carried it everywhere, apparently, and turned it toward her slightly. There were notes. An actual list. She looked at it and felt something shift uncomfortably in her chest because nobody had made notes about the practical details of her life before. Nobody had sat down and thought through what it would actually require. CDG has a partnership with a childcare network, he said. 3 locations in Chicago, 1 in Oak Park. Subsidized cost for employees. I can't make it free. It goes through HR. There are policies, but the employee rate is about 30% of what you'd pay otherwise. He looked up. Sophie would have consistent care, not a workaround. Clara looked at the list. The thing in her chest tightened further. She thought about Mrs. Okonkwo, who was kind but had her own limits and her own life, and had already been more patient than anyone should have to be. She thought about the formula can and the $1.43. She thought about the U of I website glowing at 1 a.m., that number that had felt like a joke. I need to think about it, she said. Of course. I'm not saying no, I'm saying I need to think about it. Take the time you need. He said it like he meant it, without the slight impatience that people sometimes hid under agreement when they wanted a faster answer. She nodded. She looked down at the legal pad one more time, at the list he'd made, the notes in his handwriting, which was cramped and slightly tilted to the left like most people's, and she thought that whatever happened next, this man had sat down and made a list about her life. Nobody had done that before. She thought about it for 4 days. Those 4 days contained, in order, a Fresh Mart shift where Kevin told her she looked better, and she didn't know how to explain that she hadn't slept differently, just had something to turn over in her mind. A Lenny's shift where she overtipped a table of college students who reminded her of who she'd been before she became who she was. A long Tuesday night where Sophie ran a low fever that turned out to be nothing but kept Clara awake until 3 with that specific terror that only parents of small children know, the helplessness of not being able to fix what's wrong. And a Wednesday morning where she sat at her table before her shifts and wrote on a notepad, not her phone, an actual notepad, the cheap spiral-bound kind from the dollar store, everything she could lose if this went wrong, and everything she might gain if it went right. The left column was longer. That was honest. But the right column had Sophie's future in it, not as a metaphor, not as a general feeling. She wrote it out in plain language. Sophie needs stability. I cannot give her on 3 jobs and no degree and no benefits and no future that looks different from this. She stared at that sentence for a long time. On Thursday morning, she called the number on the business card directly, not the executive assistant. He picked up on the second ring. Calloway. It's Clara Whitmore. A brief pause. Hey. I'll take it, she said. The position and the credits. She paused. I need some things to be in writing. The tuition reimbursement, the child care rate, the flexible hours. I need documentation before I sign anything. That's reasonable. Patricia can have the paperwork to you by end of day. And I need to give notice at my other jobs properly. I won't just walk out on people who are counting on me. I wouldn't expect you to. And I want to start on the courses before I start at CDG. Just one course first. I need to know I can still do it before I commit fully. There was a pause on the line, not a negative pause, more like he was listening to something beneath what she was saying. You can do it, he said. I know, she said. I just need to prove it to myself. A short silence. Okay, he said. Enroll in the first course. CDG covers it under the reimbursement agreement. Start date at the company is whenever you're ready. No pressure on the timeline. 3 weeks, she said. I'll be ready in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She hung up. She sat at her table for a moment, the notepad still in front of her, the 2 columns still visible. Then she tore the page out, folded it in half, and put it in the kitchen drawer under the takeout menu she never used and the lease she read every few months to remind herself of the exact terms she was surviving under. She didn't throw it away either. That night, she logged into the University of Illinois Continuing Education portal for the first time in 2 years. Her old login still worked. Her old transcript was still there. 7 semesters of work, the grades ranging from B+ to A-, the clear shape of someone who had been building towards something before the building stopped. She found the first course she needed, Bus 401, Business Operations and Management, 8 weeks, online, 3 credit hours. Offered starting the second Monday of December. She registered. The registration confirmation arrived in her inbox at 11:47 p.m. She read it twice, the way she'd read Ethan's first reply, the way she read anything she was afraid to believe. Then she set her phone down and lay back on the mattress with the broken spring on the left side and stared at the water stain on the ceiling, the one that looked like a hand reaching down. And she thought about how she'd been interpreting it wrong. It wasn't reaching down toward her. She didn't know what it was. It was a water stain. It didn't mean anything. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't looking at it like an omen. The 3 weeks passed with the particular quality of time that is very full and very difficult, and only makes sense once it's over. She gave notice at Fresh Mart in person to Kevin, who looked genuinely surprised and then said quietly, I always thought you were too good for this. Which was kind and also slightly infuriating in the way that things are when someone sees something in you that they never acted on until you were leaving. She thanked him. She worked her final 2 weeks with the same reliability she'd brought every day, because that was how she operated. Not out of obligation, but out of something stubborner than obligation. She gave notice at the cleaning company by phone to a supervisor she'd never met in person named Dale, who wished her well in 20 seconds and immediately moved on to filling her slot. Lenny's was harder. Pete was Pete, but there were 2 other waitresses she'd worked alongside for months. Renata, a 50-year-old from Wicker Park who'd been at Lenny's longer than the current laminated menus, and a 23-year-old named Deja, who worked nights to pay for nursing school and always shared her fries with Clara on slow nights. They gave her a small going-away moment in the back hallway. Just the three of them. A plastic cup of bad coffee, Renata saying, "Go get what you're owed, Clara, before more time gets away," in a voice that didn't ask for anything back. Clara cried for approximately 4 minutes in the alley behind Lenny's and then walked to the bus stop. She started bus 401 on the second Monday of December, exactly as scheduled. The course met twice a week as an asynchronous video lecture with weekly written assignments and one live discussion section on Thursday evenings. The first lecture was 80 minutes long and covered supply chain fundamentals and operational systems mapping, and Clara watched it at 9:30 at night, with Sophie asleep in the crib and a notepad on her knee, and the old familiar sensation, one she'd almost forgotten, of her brain engaging with something that required actual thought. She'd been afraid she'd lost it. The capacity to learn, to hold complex information, to see the shape of an argument and know where it was going. 4 years of survival-level thinking had narrowed everything down to what was immediate and practical and dangerous if ignored. She'd been afraid that the part of her that had once sat in lecture halls and followed the logic of systems and markets and organizational structures had atrophied beyond recovery. It hadn't. If anything, she understood the material differently now. Supply chain disruptions weren't abstract. They looked like the Fresh Mart shelves on a Thursday when the delivery truck was late and Kevin had to manage frustrated customers. Operational efficiency wasn't a theory. It was the math she'd been doing every morning for 14 months, calculating the exact cost of every minute and dollar and the precise consequences of a miscalculation. She wrote her first assignment in one sitting, late on a Thursday night, 2 hours after the discussion section ended. It was 1,800 words on operational bottlenecks in small service businesses. She wrote it in a specific voice, not the formal academic voice she'd used before Sophie, before everything, but something more grounded, more precise, fed by the particular kind of knowing that comes from being inside a thing rather than studying it from outside. Her professor's feedback arrived 4 days later. Strong analytical frame, real-world applications well integrated. Keep it up. She read it standing at the kitchen counter before her first shift at CDG. She let herself feel it for a full 60 seconds. The small, fierce satisfaction of being told you're capable of something by someone with no stake in making you feel good. 60 seconds. Then she pulled on her coat and went to work. Callaway Development Group occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a building on Wacker Drive, which was the kind of address that meant something in Chicago's commercial real estate world. The lobby had a security desk and tall ceilings and floors that reflected the light in a way that Clara's building's lobby would never do. Not because Clara's building was bad, but because this building had been maintained with money over decades, and money left its mark on surfaces. She'd been in buildings like this before, cleaning them. Entering as an employee was a different geometry entirely. Patricia Nguyen met her at the elevator on 14. She was in her 40s, Vietnamese American, with sharp posture and the organized efficiency of someone who ran a complicated person's schedule and had made peace with the particular chaos of that. She shook Clara's hand with a directness that Clara immediately liked. "Clara, welcome. I've got your badge, your desk assignment, your system logins, and a 30-minute orientation with me before I hand you off to Marcus in operations." She paused. "Not a big Marcus, just a..." "There's a Marcus in operations. He's fine." Clara almost said, "I used to know a Marcus." She didn't. "Sounds good," she said. The office was open plan with clusters of desks and glass-walled conference rooms along the perimeter. It was busy in the way of offices that were genuinely doing something rather than performing busyness. People on phones, working through documents, the specific focused noise of real work. Clara walked through it behind Patricia and felt the strangeness of it, the displacement of being in a new environment where the rules were not yet visible. She didn't see Ethan on that first morning. She hadn't expected to. Patricia had told her during the paperwork stage that he was traveling through Friday. But she'd still half expected his presence somewhere in the architecture of the floor, the way an employer sometimes seems embedded in a space even when absent. What she found instead was Marcus in operations, who was 37 and from Minneapolis, and had the particular straightforwardness of Midwesterners who had no patience for pretense and a great deal of patience for hard work. He showed her the project management system, the vendor database, the shared scheduling platform. He explained the current projects, 3 commercial builds, 1 mixed-use development in Pilsen, 2 properties in early acquisition phase. He asked her what she knew about project scheduling software. "I know it from the theory side," she said. "I haven't used this specific platform." "That's fine. Nobody knows it when they start. The system itself is logical. You just have to trust the logic." He pointed at a second monitor on her desk. "I'm going to give you access to the Pilsen project first. Read only for now. Just get familiar with the shape of it. Ask me anything." "Anything?" "Any question that's actually a question and not an attempt to look like you don't need to ask questions." She looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend I know things I don't know," she said. "I'm here to learn the job." "Good," he said simply, and walked back to his desk. She turned to the screen. The Pilsen project files were dense, layers of scheduling data, contractor communications, budget tables, a chain of email threads that told the story of a project in progress, the way a tree ring tells the story of years. She started at the beginning and read. By noon, she had a legal pad of questions. Not the nervous kind, the kind that meant she was paying attention. She ate lunch at her desk. A peanut butter sandwich she'd packed from home, which was not impressive but was hers. And she read through the contractor communication threads and started to see the shape of the problem they'd had last month with the concrete supplier, the way the ripple effect had hit 3 subsequent phases. And she wrote a note to herself about it because she wanted to understand how Marcus had solved it. At 3:15, she got a text on her phone from a number she now recognized. "How's the first day?" She looked at it for a moment. Then she typed back, "Marcus told me to ask real questions. I have a legal pad full of them." The reply came in about 40 seconds. "That's what I hired you for. Don't stop." She put the phone in her drawer and went back to the Pilsen files. At 5:30, she packed up her notepad and logged out of her system and put on her coat and took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out onto Wacker Drive into the cold Chicago evening, where the river 2 blocks west was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, constant, and the city was full of people going to their next thing. And Clara Whitmore was going to pick up her daughter from the CDG Child Care Center 6 blocks north, which she'd visited last week and found clean and warm and run by a woman named Susan, who had immediately gotten down on the floor to say hello to Sophie instead of doing it standing up, which Clara considered a good sign. She walked through the cold with her hands in her pockets. She wasn't sure how to feel. She was aware that nothing had been solved. She had 1 day of work behind her, 8 credits still in progress, a studio apartment with a water stain on the ceiling, and a life that was restructuring itself around terms that were not yet fully tested. She was aware that the distance between where she was and where she needed to be was still very large. But the distance had a shape now. It had a shape, and she was walking through it, and Sophie was waiting at the end of the day in a warm place, and that was enough for right now. That was more than she'd had Monday. She didn't see Ethan until the following week, a Tuesday, when she was standing at the printer on the 14th floor with a stack of vendor confirmation sheets, and he came off the elevator with his coat still on and his legal pad already out, talking to someone on the phone. He saw her across the floor. He gave her a brief nod, the same nod you'd give a colleague, nothing more, nothing less, and kept walking toward his office. She stood there with her vendor confirmations. She'd been prepared for something more complicated, for the weirdness of the dynamic, the café, the offer, the money, the history of it, to be present in the room between them and require management. What she felt instead was something quieter. She'd been treated like a colleague, not a charity case, not a project, not a story he was telling himself about his own generosity. A colleague with a nod on a Tuesday morning in an office on Walker Drive. She took her vendor confirmations back to her desk. She had a meeting with Marcus in 20 minutes about the Pilsen schedule. She had a bus 401 discussion section Thursday night. She had Sophie at home and a spring in her mattress that poked through on the left side, and a coffee maker that worked in the technical sense and a water stain on the ceiling that might not be reaching down after all. She had a legal pad full of real questions. She sat down at her desk and opened the project management system and got back to work. The second course was harder than the first. Clara had expected that, intellectually, the way you expect a hill to be steeper when you can see it from the bottom. What she hadn't expected was the specific way it would be harder. Not more difficult material, but more demanding of the part of her brain that had been running on conservation mode for 2 years. Bus 401 had felt like reactivation. Bus 412, strategic financial management, felt like being asked to sprint on a leg that had only just remembered how to walk. The professor was a man named Dr. Osei, who ran his online sessions with the cheerful severity of someone who had been teaching for 30 years and had no patience for students who confused busyness with preparation. His first discussion section, a Thursday night in January, had 7 students in the video call. By the 3rd week, one had dropped the course. Clara was not going to be the next one. She studied on the bus. She studied during her lunch breaks, eating the same rotation of sandwiches at her desk, while the Pilsen project files were open on one monitor and her course notes on her phone. She studied after Sophie went to sleep, at the small table by the window, the city outside going from dark to darker to the particular gray of 2 a.m., and she wrote out formulas by hand because she'd always learned better that way. The physical act of writing fixing information into memory in a way that typing didn't. She got a B- on the first financial modeling assignment. She sat with that grade for about 20 minutes on a Thursday evening in early February, in her apartment, with Sophie asleep and the quiet pressing in. A B- wasn't failing. A B- was fine. A B- said, "You're managing, keep going." But she'd gotten A's before everything. She knew what she was capable of when she wasn't operating at half capacity on 3.5 hours of sleep. She emailed Dr. Osei, not asking for anything, not for sympathy or extensions or regrading. She asked if he had office hours, virtual ones, where she could go over the modeling framework in more depth. He replied the next morning, Fridays, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Video link in the syllabus. Come prepared with specific questions. She came prepared with 7 specific questions. Dr. Osei, it turned out, was exactly the kind of teacher who became engaged when students engaged seriously. He spent 45 minutes with her on a Friday morning going through discounted cash flow modeling until the framework clicked into place in a way it hadn't from the lecture alone. At the end, he said, "You understand operational context better than most students in this course. The formulas are just a language. You already know what they're describing." She thanked him and closed the video call and sat at her desk at CDG. She'd taken the lunch hour for it, and she let the thing in her chest do its complicated thing for a moment before she put it away and pulled up the Pilsen project. The Pilsen project had become hers, in the way that work becomes yours when you put enough of yourself into it to stop seeing it as a task and start seeing it as a problem with a personality. Marcus had graduated her from read-only access in her 3rd week, then given her the vendor coordination role in her 5th, then quietly stepped back further in the 7th, when he realized she wasn't just executing instructions, but actually thinking 3 steps ahead of the schedule. The concrete supplier issue that she'd identified from the old email threads in her 1st week, the ripple effect she'd made notes about, turned out to be the symptom of a deeper problem with the subcontractor sequencing. Nobody had explicitly told her to fix it. She'd put a memo on Marcus's desk in week 6, laying out the issue in 2 pages, with a proposed adjustment to the Phase 3 timeline and 2 alternative vendor options she'd sourced herself. Marcus had read it, made 2 small edits, and sent it to Ethan's office with his name and Clara's both on it. She found out about that from Patricia, not Marcus. "He put your name on it," Patricia told her, in the particular tone of someone delivering information they consider important. "Marcus doesn't do that for most people in your position." Clara processed this. "Because it was my memo. Because he thought you'd earned it." Patricia handed her a stack of incoming contractor invoices. "Don't make it weird. Just keep working." Clara kept working. Tut-tut. She saw Ethan regularly now, in the way you see someone when you work in the same office and have small functional intersections with their schedule. A project update meeting on Tuesdays where she reported to Marcus, who reported to the senior development team, of which Ethan was the head. A brief hallway exchange when she was carrying something and he was moving somewhere quickly, and they were both operating in the same gravitational field for 30 seconds before the office's particular momentum pulled them apart. He was different in the office than he'd been in the café. Not worse, just different. Faster, more contained, the even qualities she'd noticed the first day compressed into something more directional. He had the specific energy of someone who spent his days making decisions with incomplete information and had gotten good at not letting the incompleteness show. She'd watched him in one project meeting. She was there to support Marcus's presentation, mostly a note-taking role. and she'd noticed how he asked questions, not to demonstrate intelligence, but to narrow the problem. He'd identify the thing that was actually in dispute and name it precisely, and then everyone else in the room would reorganize their arguments around the named thing, often without realizing he'd done it. It was a skill. She recognized skills. What she didn't allow herself to do, and she was firm about this more than once, in the small hours when the mind loosens its governance, was confuse professional respect with anything else. She knew the power dynamics of the situation clearly. He had offered her something, she had accepted it, she was working to earn it. That was the arrangement. It was a good arrangement. It was the best arrangement she'd ever been offered, and she was not going to muddy it by letting it become something with feelings in it. She kept to that, mostly. There was one evening in late February, a Tuesday, she remembered, because it was the day she'd submitted her second financial modeling assignment, the one she thought might actually be an A, when she was the last one left on the 14th floor. She'd stayed late to finish a vendor reconciliation that Marcus needed for Wednesday morning, and when she finally looked up from her screen, the floor was empty, and the city lights outside were doing the winter thing they did at 7:30. All that cold, dark glass reflecting all those warm, bright windows. She was pulling on her coat when she heard the elevator open. Ethan came out of it, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and stopped when he saw her. "Oh," he said. "I thought everyone had gone." "Almost everyone." She gestured at the cup in his left hand. "Who's the second one for?" He looked at it like he'd forgotten it. "Security desk. Gerald at my other building has a thermos habit. I picked it up." He paused. "You're here late. Vendor reconciliation for Marcus." "It's done." She slung her bag over her shoulder. "I was just leaving." He set the cups down on the nearest desk and took off his own coat, which meant he was staying, which meant she didn't need to rush out. She stood for a moment in the in-between state of someone who has their coat on but hasn't committed to the door. "How's the course going?" he asked. "Financial management. Dr. Osi." She thought about the B-, the office hours, the 45 minutes on discounted cash flow. "It's going. I had to work harder than I expected." "Good or bad?" "Both." She considered. "I thought the gap was bigger, like I thought I'd lost more of it, the ability to do the work." She was choosing her words carefully, not because she was performing something, but because she was being accurate. "But it's still there. I just have to clear some room for it." He nodded. He had the quality, she'd noticed, of listening to people without using the time to formulate his response. He actually waited until someone was finished before he decided what to say. "Marcus showed me your memo on the Pilsen sequencing," he said. "He told me. He didn't have to put your name on it." "I know, I appreciated it." Ethan picked up his coffee, the one that was his. "You were right about the subcontractor sequence. We'd been treating it as a vendor reliability problem. It was actually a scheduling design problem. Different solution." "The vendors were being blamed for a structure they couldn't work within," Claire said. "It wasn't their fault." He looked at her with something she couldn't categorize exactly. Not surprise, more like recognition. "Yeah." There was a pause, a comfortable one, which was slightly unsettling because she hadn't expected the comfort of it. "I should go get Sophie," she said. "Right." He stepped back slightly, giving her the hallway. "Good luck with the assignment." "I already submitted it." "Good luck with the grade, then." She almost smiled at that. She took the elevator down and walked out into the February cold and thought about how she'd been in this building for 2 months now, and nobody had treated her like the woman from the café except her, still, privately, in the moments when she forgot to stop. The grade on the second financial modeling assignment came back on a Friday morning, 3 days after the Tuesday hallway conversation. A-. She read it twice, confirmed it was not a different student's work displayed by an administrative error, and then went and made herself a cup of coffee from the office machine. The real one, on 15, not the floor machine that tasted like burnt rubber, and drank it standing at the window that looked north toward the river bend. She could just see between the taller buildings, and she allowed herself to feel the thing without qualifying it or reducing it to what it practically meant. She'd earned an A- in a graduate-level finance course while working full-time and raising a child alone in a studio apartment with a broken spring mattress. She'd done that. Not because someone helped her, but because she'd sat at a table at 1 a.m. with a notepad and worked through it until it made sense. The help had gotten her into the room. She was doing the rest herself. That distinction mattered to her more than she could fully explain, even to herself. It was the difference between being rescued and being given a running start, and she was only able to respect one of those things about herself. The running start she could respect. The debt of it sat differently. She forwarded Dr. Osei's grade notification to her own personal email. She didn't know why, exactly. She'd never kept documentation of her own grades like that before, but she wanted a record of it somewhere outside the course portal, somewhere that couldn't be taken away by an administrative database reset. She went back to the Pilsen files. March came in the way March always came to Chicago, not as relief from winter, but as winter's last argument, the kind of cold that is more insulting than November's cold, because by March you've already spent months earning the right to something warmer. Clara walked to the CDG Child Care Center in a sleet that couldn't quite commit to being rain or snow, and arrived with her shoulders wet and her patience slightly shorter than usual, and she collected Sophie, who had spent the day learning to pull herself up to standing by gripping the edge of a low table, and was deeply proud of this development. She did it about 15 times, Susan told her, demonstrating with a small, delighted gesture. Kept looking around to see if anyone was watching. That's very her, Clara said. Sophie, currently gripping Clara's collar with both hands and examining her mother's face with the focus of a small researcher, made a sound that was either affirmation or commentary on the sleet. On the bus home, with Sophie in the carrier and the wet cold working at the windows, Clara thought about the course. 5 weeks left in BS 412. Then one more course, Bus 45. Oh, Strategic Management Capstone. And she was done. 8 credits down. 0 remaining. A degree she'd abandoned 2 years ago finished. The practical arithmetic of it, laid out plainly, still had the quality of the unreal. She thought about Ethan's 12 words in her inbox on that first night. She thought about the legal pad with 2 columns she'd folded into the kitchen drawer. She thought about the note Renata had given her outside Lenny's was not words, Renata wasn't a words person, just a folded $10 bill with "Get a good meal for once" written on the back in ballpoint pen, which Clara had kept and not spent, which she couldn't fully account for. Sophie pulled her collar. "I know," Clara said. "Almost home." The situation with Janet Reeves happened in mid-March, and it was the first real test of something Clara hadn't needed to be tested on yet. Janet Reeves was a senior project coordinator on the 15th floor, which was the floor where the senior development team worked, which meant she was 3 levels above Clara in the practical hierarchy of CDG. She was 51, had been with the company since the beginning, and had the specific confidence of someone who had built their authority over years of real work, and had no interest in performing warmth toward people who hadn't earned their position the same way. Clara had had limited interaction with her until the Pilsen project entered its acquisition phase review, at which point the operational files Clara had been maintaining became inputs to Janet's development cost analysis, and Janet had opinions about how those files were structured. She expressed these opinions on a Tuesday afternoon by coming down to the 14th floor and dropping a printed copy of Clara's most recent project timeline on her desk, with 3 sections circled in red marker. "This vendor phasing," Janet said, without preamble, "doesn't align with how we run acquisition reviews. I need this restructured before Thursday." Clara looked at the printout. She looked at the red circles. She was aware that Janet was standing over her desk in a way that was technically professional and actually not. "What's the specific misalignment?" she asked. "The vendor confirmation windows are tied to construction phases, not acquisition milestones. We assess cost exposure by acquisition stage, not build stage." Clara looked at the timeline. She understood what Janet was saying immediately. It was a legitimate structural difference between how operations and development tracked the same information. But she also knew that restructuring the timeline the way Janet was describing would take roughly 4 hours of work and would require pulling data from 6 different vendor contracts and rescheduling a contractor call she'd already confirmed for Thursday morning. "I can restructure it," she said carefully, "but I want to make sure I understand the acquisition milestone schema before I do it, so I don't have to do it twice. Can you send me the template you use for the acquisition stage breakdown?" Janet looked at her for a moment. Clara held the look without either deference or challenge, which required a specific calibration she was only recently confident she could manage. Patricia has the template, Janet said. I'll have her send it. She picked up the printout. Then, after a half-second pause, the vendor phasing approach you used is actually more accurate for construction tracking. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it doesn't fit our review format. I understand, Clara said. Good. Janet turned and walked back toward the elevator. Clara exhaled. Marcus materialized at her shoulder approximately 90 seconds later, with the timing of someone who had been watching from a safe distance. How'd that go? He asked. She's right about the format, Clara said. I need the acquisition milestone template. Patricia's already sending it. Janet called from the elevator. He looked at her. You didn't flinch. I flinched internally. That's the correct location for it, he said, and went back to his desk. She spent the next morning rebuilding the timeline in Janet's format. It took 3.5 hours, not 4. She sent it to Marcus, who sent it up to Janet by Thursday afternoon. Janet sent back a 2-line reply. Correct. Add this format to the standard Pilsen files going forward. No thank you. No acknowledgement that it had been additional work. Just the next instruction. Clara added the format to the standard files. 2 weeks later, Janet stopped by her desk again, or not with a printout this time, just stopping, the way people stop when they're en route to somewhere and have a sidebar. The Pilsen Phase 3 contingency reserve analysis you put in the weekly summary, Janet said. Where did you get the exposure range? Historical variance from the Phase 1 concrete delay extrapolated against the current subcontractor schedule, Clara said. The range is conservative. I can show you the model. Janet looked at her for a beat. Send it to me. I'll send it in the next hour. Janet nodded and kept walking. Marcus appeared again. He had a coffee this time. She doesn't compliment people, he said. The fact that she asked for the model is the compliment. I figured, Clara said. He handed her the coffee. You figured right. She took the coffee and sent the model to Janet's email and went back to the vendor reconciliation she'd been in the middle of. But she held the small warmth of it for a moment before she put it away. The sense of having been tested on something real and not having broken, not having shrunken, not having decided that the path of least resistance was the path worth taking. That was harder than the coursework, in some ways. The coursework happened alone. This happened in front of people. April was when things got difficult. In the way things get difficult when you've been holding on for a long time and your hands start to tire from it. Boas 4-5. Oh, the capstone course started the first week of April. It was the hardest course she'd taken, not because the material was more complex than financial management, but because it demanded synthesis. It asked her to pull everything together: operations, finance, strategy, organizational design, and produce a coherent analysis of a real business case that demonstrated she could think at the level of someone who had finished the degree. The business case was a mid-sized construction company facing a competitive threat from 2 larger firms moving into their market. She was given the company's financials, operational data, and market context, and she had 12 weeks to produce a 30-page strategic analysis. She was also, in those same 12 weeks, coordinating the final phase of the Pilsen project, and being folded into 2 new projects Marcus had assigned her as CDG expanded its Milwaukee portfolio, which meant learning a new regulatory environment and a new set of vendor relationships simultaneously. And Sophie, who had been sleeping reliably for 2 months, went through a regression in early April that seemed targeted at exactly the hours Clara needed most. She didn't talk about it at work. That was its own rule. Whatever was happening at home stayed at home. She had watched, during her first 4 months at CDG, how women in offices were assessed, not unfairly but observantly, for signs of divided attention, and she had made the decision early on that she would be the person who delivered consistently, not the person whose personal circumstances got factored into expectations. She couldn't afford lowered expectations. She needed people to hold her to the same bar, so she was tired in a way that she kept invisible, which was a skill she'd developed over years, and which cost more than people knew. It was on a particularly bad Wednesday in mid-April, a day when Sophie had been up until midnight with what turned out to be a first molar coming in, and Clara had gotten to her desk at 9 on 4 hours of sleep, and there was a contractor dispute on the Milwaukee project that required 3 hours of phone calls, and she had 30 pages of capstone analysis sitting at 11 written with 19 to go, and Dr. Osei had posted a clarification about the analytical framework that required her to revisit 2 sections she'd already finished. That she was sitting in the CDG break room at 12:30 p.m. eating the same peanut butter sandwich she'd been eating every day since December and staring at the wall. Not even thinking. Just absent. The engine had gone quiet for a moment. That sandwich looks like it's in trouble. She looked up. Ethan was standing at the coffee machine. He hadn't been on the floor this week. The Milwaukee expansion had taken him there for most of the month, and she hadn't expected to see him. "The sandwich is fine," she said. "You look like you haven't slept." "I'm fine." He poured his coffee and came and sat down across from her in the break room, which was a thing he had apparently decided to do, and she didn't have the energy to be complicated about it. "How far through the capstone are you?" he asked. She looked at him. "You know about the capstone." "I know you're finishing your degree. I've been paying attention. 11 pages. I need 30. When's it due?" 5 weeks. "And Pilsen?" "Final phase summary by end of month. Milwaukee is active." She said the last word with a specific dryness that communicated the contractor dispute without naming it. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He didn't offer to fix anything, didn't suggest adjustments or workarounds, or the kind of solutions that people offer when they want to be helpful but don't actually know what would help. "Sophie okay?" he asked. She was briefly surprised. Teething. She's fine. Olivia had a rough stretch at that age. He said it the way he said things like that, matter-of-factly, not making it into a bonding moment or a parallel, just information. There's a window where they're miserable and you can't do much except be there. That's exactly what it is. It ends. I know it ends. A short silence. The break room hummed with the refrigerator. "You're going to finish the capstone," he said. "I'm not saying that to be encouraging. I'm saying it because you've done everything harder than this since you started, and you haven't stopped." She looked at him across the break room table. There was a vending machine behind him, and fluorescent lighting, and the very ordinary ugliness of a workplace break room, and he was sitting in it in a $2,000 coat he hadn't bothered to take off, and telling her a thing she needed to hear in a way that sounded like observation rather than charity. "The Milwaukee contractor dispute is going to resolve by Friday," he said. "I'll call them today." "That's my problem too." "It's been escalated. Jamie in legal is handling the contract side. I'll take the relationship side. You close out the coordination documentation." He said it as a partition of labor, not a rescue. "That frees you the 3 hours of calls you've been sitting on." She could argue that. She had thought about arguing it several times already that morning, the impulse to handle everything herself being one of the more exhausting aspects of her own character. But 3 hours was 3 hours, and 19 pages was 19 pages. "Okay," she said. "Okay." He stood up. "Eat the sandwich." "I was going to." He left. She ate the sandwich. She went back to her desk and opened the capstone document and looked at page 11 and wrote the first sentence of page 12. By Friday, the Milwaukee contractor dispute had been resolved. By Sunday night, she was on page 17 of the capstone. Sophie's molar was through the gum enough that the worst of it was over, and she slept 5 hours in a row on Saturday night, which felt like a physiological miracle. Clara wrote at the table by the window until midnight, the city doing its 11 p.m. thing outside, and she thought about what Ethan had said in the break room. Not the encouraging part. She'd heard encouraging things before. They were easy, they cost nothing. The specific part. You've done everything harder than this, and you haven't stopped. He'd been watching. Not the way someone watches when they're checking on an investment. The way someone watches when they actually want to know how something turns out. She filed that information. She didn't do anything with it. But she kept it, the same way she'd kept the business card and the $10 bill from Renata and the course confirmation email from December. Some things you held on to without knowing exactly why. Boy, May arrived, and with it, the end of things. She submitted the capstone analysis on a Monday morning at 7:43 a.m., 22 minutes before the deadline, and she closed her laptop and sat in her apartment in the early light with Sophie eating banana slices from the tray of her high chair, a second-hand one she'd bought in March with the first month she'd felt she had enough margin to spend on something non-essential, and she felt something she couldn't name for a moment. Relief, yes, but something under that. something that took her longer to identify. It was the feeling of having arrived somewhere after a very long walk and finding that the place looked like she'd imagined and also completely different, and that you couldn't fully separate the satisfaction of being there from the particular exhaustion of how you got there, and that maybe the two were inseparable in the end. Sophie held out a banana slice. Clara took it. "Thank you," she said. Sophie examined her with the evaluative seriousness she brought to everything, apparently determined her mother's response had been adequate, and went back to the remaining slices. The grade from BS 450 would come in 3 weeks. Dr. Ose had said, at the end of the final discussion section, that the cohort had produced strong work this semester and that he was looking forward to reading the final analyses. He had looked at Clara specifically when he said it, or she thought he had. She was no longer entirely sure what she imagined and what she actually perceived. 4 months of not enough sleep had slightly blurred that border. She went to work. She put the Pilsen final phase summary on Marcus's desk by Wednesday. She filed the Milwaukee coordination documentation. She answered 17 emails and joined 2 meetings and ate the same peanut butter sandwich at 12:30 p.m. and left at 5 to get Sophie from the childcare center. On Thursday evening, she received an email from the University of Illinois office of the registrar confirming that all 8 credit hours had been recorded and that her degree, Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, would be formally conferred at the May graduation ceremony on the 22nd, pending final grade verification. She sat with that email for a long time. Sophie was asleep. The city was doing what it did. The water stain on the ceiling was, as always, neither reaching nor retreating, just existing, which was all any of them were doing at any given moment. She forwarded the email to herself again, to the same personal account where she'd sent the A- grade notification in February. Then she picked up her phone and she wrote a text to the number she'd been texting professionally for 5 months about vendor timelines and project updates and scheduling conflicts. Degree conferred. Graduation May 22nd. She didn't know what she expected. It was late. He was probably in Milwaukee or in a meeting or dealing with something that actually mattered. The reply came in 4 minutes. "I know. Patricia ordered the flowers 3 weeks ago." She read that twice. He told Patricia to order flowers 3 weeks ago, before the capstone was submitted, before the grade. While she was still sitting in the break room on 4 hours of sleep with 19 pages to write and a contractor dispute on the phone, she put the phone down. The apartment was quiet. Sophie breathed in the crib. The city moved outside. Clara Whitmore sat at her table and felt the thing in her chest do something that wasn't the tightening this time. Something that went in a different direction entirely. Something that opened rather than closed, that let air in where she'd been holding it out for a long time. She didn't name it. She wasn't ready to name it. But she didn't shut it down either. She sat with it, the way you sit with something true that you're not yet sure what to do with. And outside the window on a Thursday night in May, Chicago breathed around her, indifferent and enormous, and somehow, strangely, not as cold as it had been in November. Patricia had ordered white peonies. Clara found this out the morning of May 22nd, when she arrived at the University of Illinois at Chicago Pavilion, with Sophie in the carrier in her graduation gown folded over one arm and her hair actually done for the first time since she could remember, and found Ethan and a 5-year-old girl she'd never met standing near the entrance holding a wrapped bouquet that was, objectively, too large for the occasion. She stopped walking. He saw her at the same moment and came toward her, and the girl beside him had dark hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, the kind of pigtails assembled by a father without assistance. And she was wearing a yellow dress and holding the bottom of Ethan's coat with one hand, the way small children hold things when they're in unfamiliar places and need an anchor. "Clara," Ethan said. He looked at Sophie first because Sophie was hard to miss, and Sophie looked back at him with the profound, evaluative stare she deployed toward all new situations. "You made it." "I live here," Clara said. I'm from here. I was always going to make it." "Fair point." The girl looked up at her. "Are you Clara?" Clara looked down. "I am." "Are you Olivia?" The girl considered this for a moment as though confirming her own identity required some reflection. "Yes. My dad talks about you at dinner." A small silence. Ethan looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who had made a tactical error in his parenting that was now manifesting in public. "Olivia," he said. "What? You do?" What does he say? Clara asked. Olivia appeared to search her memory with genuine effort. He says you're very good at your job and that you work very hard and that… She paused, something flickering across her face, with the particular delight of a 5-year-old who has discovered information is a form of power. And that Sophie is going to be interesting when she gets older. Clara looked at Ethan. He handed her the flowers. Congratulations, he said, on finishing. She took the bouquet. It was heavy, the way real flowers are heavy when someone has bought too many of them. The white peonies wrapped in brown paper with a small card tucked into the side that she didn't read right then, but held. Sophie reached immediately for the nearest bloom with focused determination. Don't, Clara told her. Sophie reconsidered her plan but did not abandon it. We'll find seats, Ethan said. Go get your hood. She went. Walking away from them through the pavilion lobby with the bouquet in one arm and Sophie in the carrier and her gown over the other arm, she was aware of a feeling she couldn't fully process in real time, and so didn't try to. She filed it in the place where she'd been filing things since November. The 12-word email, the break room conversation, the text about flowers ordered 3 weeks early, and she kept walking. She had a degree to pick up. The graduation ceremony was exactly what graduation ceremonies are: long, earnest, punctuated by applause at intervals, and meaningful in a way that is slightly blunted by the logistics of the event itself. Clara sat in the third row of the business administration section in her gown and cap, and she listened to the dean's address and looked at the stage and thought about the U of I portal glowing at 1 a.m. 2 years ago, that number that had looked like a joke. When they called her name, Clara Marie Whitmore, Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, and she walked across the stage and shook the dean's hand and took the rolled diploma and turned toward the audience. She did not look for Ethan. She looked at Sophie. Sophie was in Ethan's arms. He'd taken her when Clara left to line up, a handoff she hadn't planned, but that had happened with the practical efficiency of two people who were both trying to make a situation work. And her daughter was not watching the stage. She was examining the tassel on Ethan's jacket with the full force of her investigative faculties. Clara laughed, quietly, mostly to herself, there on the stage in front of 400 people who were already applauding for the next name. She walked back to her seat. On the way, she passed Ethan's row. They'd found seats close to the aisle, and Sophie looked up and saw her, and made the sound she made when Clara had been gone too long, the reaching sound, the arms out sound, and Clara touched her daughter's hand as she passed, and Sophie grabbed her finger and held it for exactly the 3 seconds it took Clara to move out of reach. She sat back down in the business administration section, and she pressed her lips together, and she did not cry, which required actual effort. She'd earned the not crying the same way she'd earned everything else. After the ceremony, outside in the May afternoon, warm enough to finally mean it, the kind of Chicago spring day that felt like an apology for February. They stood in the shifting crowd of graduates and families and flowers and photograph taking, and Olivia held Sophie's hand with the grave concentration of a child who has been given an important responsibility and intends to discharge it properly. Sophie stood. She'd been walking for 6 weeks now, still with the wide-legged uncertainty of the newly upright. And Olivia stood beside her, slightly taller, slightly steadier, both of them squinting into the same patch of afternoon light. Clara watched them. She walks now, Ethan said beside her. Since April. Clara adjusted her cap, which had been sliding sideways since the recessional. She figured out it was faster than crawling, and there was no going back. Olivia was the same. One day she just committed. They were standing close enough that she could see the slight lines around his eyes that she'd noticed the first day in the café and which she'd since catalogued, against her better judgment, as one of the more specific things about his face. She was aware of the closeness and aware of being aware of it, which was the more complicated condition. She opened the card from the bouquet. It said, in handwriting she recognized as his, cramped, left-tilted, 8 credits. You did the whole thing. E. She read it twice. She folded it along its original crease and put it in the inside pocket of her gown. You didn't have to come, she said. I know. You didn't have to bring Olivia. She asked to come. He paused. After I told her about the graduation. At dinner. He looked at her sideways. She has a very accurate memory. She seems like someone who pays attention. She gets that honestly. Clara looked at him then, properly, in the May afternoon with the crowd moving around them and their daughters holding hands on the grass. He looked back. There was a beat that lasted slightly longer than functional, that had something in it she'd been carefully not naming for months. She looked away first. "I need to take some photos," she said. "Mrs. Okonkwo is going to want to see them." "Of course." She took photos. Olivia insisted on being in several of them with Sophie, with the proprietary confidence of someone who had decided these two families were already connected and the adults hadn't caught up yet. Clara took a photo of Sophie sitting in the grass holding a single peony Ethan had detached from the bouquet for exactly this purpose. And Sophie held it with the ceremonial seriousness of someone who understood the significance of occasions even without the vocabulary for them. It was taken all together the best day Clara had had in several years. She didn't say that out loud. It felt too large to say out loud, and also slightly dangerous. The way things are dangerous when you've been careful for a long time and you feel the careful starting to loosen. The grade from bus 4-5. O arrived on a Tuesday, 10 days after graduation. A. Not a minus. A flat. On the capstone analysis that Dr. Osei had spent the final session calling the most practically grounded work the cohort had produced. She was in the CDG break room again when she read it, which felt appropriate. The same break room, the same refrigerator hum, the same fluorescent light. Different Clara, slightly. Or the same Clara with more documented evidence of what she was capable of. She forwarded it to her personal email. Third time she'd done that. The archive was growing. She went back to her desk and pulled up the inbox, and there was an email from Marcus with the subject line, "Need to talk. Today, if possible." Her stomach did a brief, involuntary thing. The conditioned response of someone who had spent years in situations where need to talk preceded something being taken away. She replied, "I'm at my desk." He appeared in approximately 4 minutes, which was either good news or very bad news delivered quickly. He sat in the chair beside her desk, the one she'd put there for exactly these kinds of conversations, because people were slightly less formal sitting beside you than standing over you. And he had his coffee and his neutral Marcus expression, which told her nothing because Marcus ran neutral as his default. "So," he said. "So," she said. "I've been talking to Ethan and Janet about the team structure as we go into the second half of the year. Milwaukee's expanding, Pilsen wraps in August, and we're looking at 2 new acquisitions in the fall." He drank his coffee. "We need a senior operations coordinator." Clara looked at him. "The job currently doesn't exist," he continued. "I'm building the position. It would oversee coordination across all active projects. That's currently 3, potentially 5 by November. It would interface with Janet's team directly on acquisition analysis. It pays $68,000 to start, with a performance review at 6 months. He set his coffee down. "I want to know if you want it before I write up the formal posting." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been here 5 months, she said. "I know. That's a fast promotion." "Yes. People on this floor have been here longer." "I know that too." "Are you going to have a problem with those people if you give this to me?" Marcus looked at her with the straight-faced steadiness of a man who had spent his career making decisions and defending them. "Dave Chen has been here 3 years and is excellent at following process and genuinely lost when anything deviates from it. Kim Alvarez is smart and will be ready for something like this in about 18 months. You're ready now." He paused. "The job requires someone who can see the whole board, not just their piece of it. You've been seeing the whole board since your 3rd week." She thought about the Pilsen memo on Marcus's desk in week 6. She thought about Janet and the acquisition milestone format. She thought about the Milwaukee contractor dispute and the models she'd sent Janet and the capstone analysis and the A that was sitting in her email right now. She thought about the woman at a counter with $1.43. "Yes," she said, "I want it." "Good." He stood up. "I'll write the posting as a formality. HR requires it, but it's yours if you want it." He picked up his coffee. "Finish the Pilsen summary by end of month, and that gives me something to point to in the review meeting." "The summary's already done. I sent it to you last Wednesday." He stopped. "I know. I'm pointing to it in the meeting today." He looked at her with something that, on Marcus, passed for warmth. Get back to work. She got back to work. At 5:30, she texted Ethan. Still the professional number, still the same convention. And she wrote, Marcus offered me senior ops coordinator. I said yes. The reply came in 3 minutes. I know. I approved the position this morning. She thought about that for a moment. Then, you could have told me. Marcus wanted to tell you. It was his call to make. She put her phone in her bag and took the elevator down and walked out onto Wacker Drive and stood for a moment in the May evening, the river visible 2 blocks north, the city in full spring for once actually living up to the promise of it. And she thought about what it meant, the accumulation of these things, and whether she was building toward something or had already arrived somewhere without recognizing it. The question didn't resolve, but she let herself hold it without the anxiety of needing it to. The shift in their dynamic, hers and Ethan's, happened gradually, and then all at once, the way shifts like that always happen. It started with the practical. The senior ops coordinator role required her to interface with the senior development team directly, which meant regular time in meetings with Ethan, not as Marcus's support, but as a principal contributor. She spoke in those meetings differently than she had before. She had the Pilsen data in her bones now, the Milwaukee contractor relationships, the acquisition analysis format she'd built with Janet's framework. She spoke with the authority of someone who had done the work, and people in the room treated her accordingly. Ethan treated her the way he always had, as someone worth listening to. But now the context was formal, and the professional respect had a structure around it, and the structure made something easier to see. She was good at this. Not being given a chance good. Actually good. The kind of good that showed up in outcomes and documentation, and the specific way Janet Reeves had stopped explaining her own analytical framework to Clara and started asking Clara to explain it to new staff. Outside the formal structure, things were slower, harder to map. He started texting about things that weren't work sometimes. Not often, not in a way that felt like a declaration. Small things. A photo of Olivia at a school recital where she had apparently refused to sing, but stood at the microphone with great dignity and stared at the audience for the duration of the song instead. A note one Tuesday morning that the coffee machine on 15 was broken and he'd sent someone to fix the one on 14. Practical information that could have gone through Patricia but didn't. Once, late on a Thursday, Sophie sleeping yet? To which she'd replied finally, and he'd sent back same, and that had been a full exchange in 8 words about the particular exhaustion of single parenthood, the most human exchange they'd had since the break room in April. She allowed it. She didn't encourage it. She held the line she'd drawn with a steadiness that cost her something, and she didn't examine the cost too carefully because that way lay decisions she wasn't ready to make. The line broke on a Friday evening in late June. She'd stayed late again, She had a habit of it, the quiet of the emptied office suiting the kind of thinking the job required. And she was working through acquisition cost projections for the first of the fall properties when she heard his office door open. His office was on 15, but he'd been down on 14 for a meeting that had apparently run long, and she'd been only distantly aware of his presence the way she was always distantly aware of his presence. A background register she'd given up pretending wasn't there. He came and stood in the opening to her workspace, not at her desk, just at the opening, the way you stand when you're not sure if you're interrupting. "You're always the last one here," he said. "You're always the last one here, too." "I'm the boss." That seems like a reason to leave earlier, not later. He almost smiled at that. He came and sat in the chair beside her desk, the same one Marcus used, she noted, the one she'd positioned for conversations. And he had his coat on like he'd been about to leave and had changed direction. "I was going to ask if you wanted to get dinner," he said. She stopped typing. The words sat between them in the quiet of the emptied floor, very specific, not casual, not wrapped in ambiguity. He had the quality, when he said important things, of saying them plainly and then being still, which was both admirable and extremely difficult to deflect from. "Ethan," she said. "I know. You know what? That there are about 12 reasons why you're going to say no." He held her gaze. It was the steadiest thing about him, always, that gaze. "I'm not going to argue with any of them. I'm just asking." She looked at him. The 12 reasons organized themselves efficiently in her mind. She'd been maintaining them for months. The power differential. The professional structure. the history of the offer, and the acceptance and the debt of it, or what felt like debt even when he'd never framed it that way. The risk of misreading kindness, which she'd done before, catastrophically. The fundamental question of whether she'd rebuilt herself enough to trust her own judgment about a thing like this. And underneath the 12 reasons, a different register entirely. The one she'd been refusing to let speak for months. The one that had started in a break room in April and grown quietly in the space between professional texts and dinner handoffs, and a 5-year-old in uneven pigtails holding her daughter's hand on a graduation afternoon. Sophie will be at childcare until 6, she said. Something shifted slightly in his face. Not relief. He hadn't been performing anxiety, but something that acknowledged what she'd just said. Olivia's with my sister until 7, he said. Just dinner, she said. Just dinner. She saved her document. She shut the monitor off. She put on her coat. They took the elevator down together in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of information. Outside on Wacker Drive, the June evening was warm in the way June evenings in Chicago are when the city is finally the version of itself it's been promising to be since October. Soft light, actual warmth. The river 2 blocks north catching the last of it. Where do you want to go? He asked. Somewhere that has actual food, she said. I've been eating the same sandwich for 6 months. I've noticed. It's a good sandwich. Clara. What? It's peanut butter every day. It's reliable, she said, and then she laughed. And he laughed too. A real laugh, not a polite one, the kind that required being actually caught off guard. And they walked south on Wacker Drive in the June evening, and it was, she thought, the most normal she had felt in a very long time. Not fixed, not saved, just normal, with another person, in the light. Neat. Dinner was at a Thai place on the near north side that was neither expensive nor impressive, and had the specific quality of a restaurant that had been good for a long time and knew it, and didn't need to do anything about it. They ordered too much. This happened naturally, without discussion, both of them apparently operating on the shared logic of two people who had spent periods of their lives eating insufficiently and were not going to be modest about it now. He told her about the year after his wife died. Not the version Clara had expected, the polished version, the resilience narrative, the redemption arc. The real one. The version with the 3 a.m. feeds where he'd sat in Olivia's room on the floor with his back against the crib because he was too tired to get up and too afraid to leave. And he hadn't been sure if the fear was for Olivia or from being alone with the specific silence of a house that used to have someone in it and now didn't. The version where the company had almost folded in month 7 because he'd made a financial decision based on emotion rather than analysis, and it had taken him 3 months to admit it was an emotional decision. The version where he'd been difficult to be around for about a year, and the people closest to him had stayed anyway, not because he'd been graceful about his grief, but because they'd decided he was worth the difficulty. You weren't graceful about it, she said. No. But people stayed. Some did. She held her tea. I didn't have that. When Marcus, my Marcus, left, there wasn't a network of people who stayed. She said it without self-pity, just as a description of a landscape. I'd moved for him, and his people were his people, and my family is in Rockford, and my mother has her own. It's complicated there. So it was just me and Sophie, and Elise in someone else's neighborhood. That's a hard start. It made me efficient, she said. I learned to solve things alone because there was no other option. She looked at her cup. The problem with that is it stops feeling like a coping strategy and starts feeling like a personality. And then you're suspicious of anyone who offers to help because the help has always come with something attached, and you can't tell the difference anymore between an offer and a transaction. He was quiet for a moment. When I walked over to you in the café, he said slowly, I genuinely don't know if it was entirely altruistic. I've thought about that. He looked at her directly. I saw something that reminded me of a version of my own situation, and I reacted to it. Whether that was about you or about a past version of me. I don't know. I don't think it was cynical, but I also don't think it was pure. She looked at him. This was the thing she thought about him. He said the complicated truth about himself the way he said everything else. Evenly, without performance, without the defensive framing that most people wrapped around their difficult admissions. It wasn't a transaction, she said. Whatever the reason, it wasn't a transaction. I've been in enough of those to know the difference by the end. Were you sure in the beginning? No, she said. I was watching for the catch the whole first month. And now? She considered. Now I think you're a person who went through something hard and came out of it with a specific set of convictions about what's worth doing. And one of them is not walking past someone who's standing at a counter with $1. She paused. And I think that's allowed to be complicated and still be true. He was quiet. Outside, the near north side evening moved through its Friday rhythms. Groups of people, music from somewhere, a couple arguing on the sidewalk with the focused energy of a disagreement that had been ongoing longer than tonight. I don't know how to do this, she said. Whatever this is, I'm not good at... She stopped. Tried again. I built all those walls Marcus described. I got efficient at not needing people. And you know that. You've described the same thing in yourself, which means we're both sitting here as people who got excellent at not being vulnerable and are now apparently at dinner. The walls thing, he said. I said it felt like strength for a while. And then you can't get out of it. Yeah. He looked at her. I'm still partly in mine. I want to be clear about that. I don't have this figured out. I know. She felt something loosen slightly in her chest. I don't need you to have it figured out. No? I've been managing my own expectations for years. I know how to proceed carefully. Is that what this is? Proceeding carefully? She thought about the card in her coat pocket, the peony in the May afternoon, the 12 words in November. This is dinner, she said. We said just dinner. We did. A short, honest silence. Ask me again, she said. He looked at her. Not now, she said. Not tonight. We both have to go get our daughters, but ask me again. Later. When it's been long enough that we both know what we're asking. He held her gaze for a moment. Okay, he said. They paid for dinner. They split it without discussing it, both of them reaching for their wallets at the same time, which resolved itself into his covering the total and her leaving the tip, which was a negotiation conducted entirely without words and which made her trust the whole evening slightly more, not less. Outside, they stood on the sidewalk in the June warmth. I'll see you Monday, she said. Monday, he agreed. She walked to the L stop and took the train to the CDG Childcare Center and collected Sophie, who had spent the evening eating things and being read to and had strong opinions about being put in the carrier, but recovered from the indignity of it by the time they were on the bus home. Clara sat with her daughter on the bus and held her and felt the weight of her, and thought about the dinner and the walls and the 12 reasons, and the way he'd said okay when she'd asked him to ask again later. Not, of course, not I will, not anything that managed the moment or made it easier, just okay with the same evenness that had been his consistent register since November. The quality she'd identified in a café when she was suspicious of it, and which she was still, she admitted to herself, slightly suspicious of, because she'd been suspicious for a long time and some habits were too structural to reverse in a single evening. But she was aware, sitting on the bus in June with Sophie half asleep against her shoulder, that the line she'd drawn was no longer exactly where she'd drawn it. That was true. She let it be true without doing anything about it. Outside the bus window, Chicago moved through its Friday night, enormous and various and entirely indifferent to the interior weather of any single person on any single bus, which was, she had always found, both the most frustrating and the most comforting thing about living in it. The foundation idea came up for the first time in July, which Clara did not know at the time, and which would change the shape of the next several years. It came from an unlikely moment. A Tuesday staff meeting where Ethan was presenting the company's Q3 strategy and included, almost as a footnote, a line about CDG's community investment portfolio. He mentioned, in the passing way that leaders mention things they've been thinking about seriously, that he'd been considering a structured philanthropic arm, something beyond the standard corporate giving, something more direct. Clara wrote it down. She didn't say anything in the meeting. She sat in the third chair from the left with her project status update in front of her, and she wrote in the margin of her notepad, community investment, structured, direct. After the meeting, she went back to her desk, and she sat with those 3 words, and she thought about what direct meant when you were talking about people who needed help the way she had needed help. Not the charity version of direct, the arm's length version, where you wrote a check and felt good about the outcome. The actual direct version, where someone sat down across from you and saw what the problem actually was and offered something specific. She thought about the $1.43. She thought about Mrs. Okonkwo's patience. She thought about the U of I portal at 1 a.m., that number that had looked like a joke. She drafted a memo, not a long one, 2 pages. She laid out a framework for what a structured support program for single parents in poverty might look like, using CDG's infrastructure, the HR partnerships, the childcare network, the tuition reimbursement protocol, as a model for what could be replicated or expanded with a dedicated funding structure. She was careful. She was specific. She used her operational skills the way she always used them, to map the shape of the problem and the logical path from here to there. She put it in a folder on her desktop and did not send it to anyone. Not yet. She thought about timing. She thought about what she was still building here, the credibility she was still earning, and whether this was the right moment or the moment before the right moment. She had learned something in the past 7 months. There was a difference between knowing something was true and knowing it was time. She'd spent her life conflating the two out of urgency, acting on what was true before the time was right, because waiting had always felt like losing. She was learning, slowly, not gracefully, that timing was its own kind of intelligence. She closed the folder. She went back to the acquisition projections. She had work to do. Sophie turned 1 in August. The birthday party was small. Mrs. Okonkwo, Susan from the childcare center, Renata and Deja from Lenny's, who Clara had stayed in contact with. And because Olivia had heard about the birthday from her father and had produced a response of such conviction that declining would have been logistically complex, Ethan and his daughter. They gathered in Clara's studio apartment, which she had been in the process of leaving. She'd signed a lease on a 1-bedroom in Lincoln Square the week before, the first apartment she'd chosen because she wanted it, rather than because it was the least impossible option available, and which looked, on this last weekend in it, simultaneously too small for the occasion and exactly right for what the occasion actually was. Olivia brought Sophie a stuffed elephant with very serious ears, selected, according to Ethan, entirely on Sophie's own authority after Olivia had been shown several options, and Sophie had reached for this specific one with the decisive certainty of someone who had already made up their mind. Sophie held the elephant for the duration of the party. Mrs. Okonkwo made the cake, which she did every year for every child she'd ever watched, and it was a good cake, a simple yellow cake with white frosting and 1 candle. And Sophie regarded the single flame with the focused attention she brought to all new phenomena, and when Clara leaned over and blew it out on her behalf, Sophie looked at the extinguished candle and then looked at her mother with an expression of concentrated betrayal that made the whole room laugh. Clara picked her up. Sophie, mollified by proximity, allowed it. Clara stood there in her too small apartment with her daughter on her hip and her daughter's first birthday happening around her. Mrs. Okonkwo and Renata talking in the kitchen, Deja helping Olivia set up something with blocks on the floor, Ethan leaning against the counter near the window with a paper cup of something and watching it all with the expression she'd cataloged over months, as the one he had when he was somewhere he'd chosen to be. And she felt the weight of the year in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. 12 months since the café, since the dollar, and the counter, and the crying, and the stranger's voice saying, "Come sit down," since the 12 words in her inbox and the card on the table and the 2 columns on a notepad in a kitchen drawer. A year. She looked at Sophie, who was looking at the elephant. She looked at the apartment, the water stain on the ceiling she was about to stop looking at, the mattress she'd already moved to the curb, the table by the window where she'd sent the email and done the coursework and written the memo that was still sitting in a folder on her desktop. She looked at Ethan. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching Olivia and Deja on the floor, and his expression was the one he had when he watched Olivia and didn't know he was being observed, something open and unguarded that he didn't wear in offices or meetings or anywhere the world could use it. He felt her looking. He turned. They held each other's gaze across the small room, past Mrs. Okonkwo and the cake and the stuffed elephant, and Olivia explaining something important to Deja about the structural integrity of block towers. And something passed between them that didn't need words and didn't get any. She looked away first, same as always. But this time she was smiling when she did it. The memo sat in its desktop folder for 6 weeks. Clara opened it occasionally, not to edit it, just to look at it. The way you look at something you've committed to but haven't yet acted on, checking whether it still seems true from a different vantage point. It did. It kept seeming true, which meant the hesitation wasn't about the idea itself. It was about something else. The particular vulnerability of putting something personal in a professional container and asking people to take it seriously. Because the memo was personal. She understood that even as she'd written it in the careful, operational language of someone who had spent 7 months learning how structures worked. Underneath the framework and the cost projections and the proposed delivery model, the memo was about a woman standing at a counter with $1.43, and what a different architecture of support might have meant for her 5 years earlier. 2 years earlier. For the version of her that had dropped out of school at 28, because the system she was navigating had no interest in whether she made it. She knew what she was asking people to fund. She knew what she was asking them to believe was worth funding. And she knew, in the way you know things you've earned rather than learned, that the argument was strongest when it was honest about where it came from. She sent the memo to Ethan on a Wednesday morning in September. No preamble, no covering email, just the 2-page document with the subject line, Community Investment, the direct version. He replied 4 hours later, "Come to my office at 4." She went to his office at 4 p.m. Bam. His office on 15 was the kind of space that revealed something about its occupant by what it didn't contain. No art on the walls that looked chosen by an interior designer. No awards or framed press coverage. One photograph on the desk she'd never looked at directly, but which she was fairly certain was Olivia. A whiteboard along one wall covered in diagrams and numbers in his cramped left-tilted handwriting. The legal pad, always, somewhere. He was standing at the whiteboard when she came in, which was how she'd learned he thought, on his feet, with something to write on nearby. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Sit down or stand, either is fine." He turned from the whiteboard. He had her memo in his hand, printed, with annotations in the margins. She could see the handwriting from across the room. "I've been sitting with this since this morning. I know, 4 hours is a long time for you. It's a complicated document. It's 2 pages. 2 dense pages." He set it on the desk. "Walk me through the delivery model, the part about intake criteria." She did. She stood in his office for 40 minutes and she walked him through the framework she'd built. The intake process for identifying single parents in financial crisis who had incomplete post-secondary education, the partnership structure with community colleges and universities, the employment placement model using CDG's HR infrastructure as the template, the childcare support component, the 12-month stabilization window. She walked through it the way she walked through operational presentations. No performance, no overselling, just the shape of the thing. He asked questions, real ones, the kind that meant he was already pressure testing the model rather than evaluating whether to take it seriously, the distinction she'd learned to hear in this office. "The intake criteria," he said, "you've set it at single parents below 200% of federal poverty line with at least 2 years of incomplete post-secondary education." Why 2 years? Because 2 years means they had enough exposure to the material to have a foundation. Less than that, and you're not rebuilding something, you're building from scratch, which requires a different intervention. She paused. "And because that was me, I was being specific about what I know." He looked at her. "I know," she said. "That's the whole thing. The memo is about me, dressed up in operational language. I'm not pretending otherwise. I'm not asking you to." He sat on the edge of his desk. "The employment placement component. You're modeling it on what I offered you." "I'm modeling it on what worked, which was the thing you offered me, operationalized into something that doesn't require a billionaire to have coffee at the right café at the right time." She said it directly, not unkindly. "That's the point. The outcome I got shouldn't depend on a coincidence." He was quiet for a moment. "How much are you thinking for initial funding?" She had the number ready. $800,000 for a pilot year. That funds 12 families through the full program. Education completion, employment placement, childcare support, 12-month stabilization. The per-family cost comes down significantly at scale if the employment placement component generates retention data that attracts corporate partners. You've already thought about the scale model. I think in systems, it's the job. He almost smiled. It's you, not the job. Maybe both. He stood up. He walked to the whiteboard and wrote the number, $800,000, in large figures in the center. He drew a circle around it. Then he turned back to her. "I'll fund the pilot," he said. "CDG covers the 800,000. You run it, not as a side project, as a formal program director role. We build it as a nonprofit arm with its own governance structure, its own board, its own identity." He looked at her steadily. "This isn't CDG's charity, it's yours. I'm providing the initial capital and the infrastructure. You build the thing." Clara stood very still. She'd expected negotiation. She'd expected questions about ROI and brand alignment, and whether this was the right moment in CDG's growth cycle. She'd done the analysis for all of those objections. She'd prepared for the conversation to take longer, to require more. "You're not going to push back on any of it?" she asked. "I pushed back for 40 minutes. The model holds." He set down the marker. "You've been building toward this since you sent me that email in November. You just didn't know it was this you were building toward." She looked at the number on the whiteboard, $800,000, circled in blue marker, in an office on Wacker Drive on a Wednesday afternoon. "I need to think about the program director role," she said. "I know. I'm good at the operations work. The senior coordinator position is Clara." He said her name with a particular quality. Not impatient, just specific, the way you say someone's name when you want them to actually hear you. "You were always going to do something bigger than vendor coordination. You knew that. I knew it the day Marcus sent me the Pilsen memo with your name on it." He paused. "This is the bigger thing." She looked at the whiteboard. She looked at the memo on his desk, her words and his handwriting's annotations, two things occupying the same space. "I want it in writing," she said. "The funding commitment, the governance structure, my authority over program decisions. All of it documented before I agree to anything. Patricia can have the term sheet to you by Friday. And I want Janet on the board." He raised an eyebrow. "Janet, she understands financial accountability at an institutional level, and she doesn't tell people what they want to hear." Clara met his gaze. "I need people on the board who will push back on me the way she pushed back on the acquisition format. I don't want a board full of people who'll agree with everything I propose because I built the thing." A full beat of silence. "I'll ask her," he said. "She'll say yes," Clara said. "She likes problems that are actually hard." "How do you know that?" "Because she's still here after 10 years when she could have gone to a bigger firm 3 times. Clara picked up her copy of the memo. "She likes problems that matter. This one matters." She walked to the door. "Clara," he said. She turned. He was standing in front of the whiteboard with the circled number behind him and the legal pad on the desk beside him, and he looked for a moment like someone who had something to say that was outside the professional register they'd been operating in for the past 40 minutes. "Ask me," she said, before he could. He looked at her. "Not now," she said. The same words she'd said in June, but differently. "Friday. After Patricia sends the term sheet and we've both looked at it and we both know what the arrangement is." She paused. "Then ask me." He held her gaze for a moment. "Friday," he said. She left. She spent Thursday in a state she didn't entirely trust, a kind of heightened clarity, where everything felt slightly more vivid than usual, where the Pilsen closeout meeting in the morning and the Milwaukee progress call in the afternoon both seemed to happen at a slight remove, while the real part of her mind was elsewhere, occupied with the shape of the future in a way it hadn't been since she'd stopped allowing herself to imagine one. She called her mother that evening. This was not something she did often. Their relationship had the specific texture of two people who loved each other and also had a long history of not quite meeting in the middle, her mother's life in Rockford having diverged far enough from Clara's in Chicago that the distance was partly geographical and partly something harder to map. But she called, and her mother answered, and they talked for 40 minutes about Sophie and the new apartment in Lincoln Square, and the promotion, and her mother said, "I always knew you'd figure it out," which was the kind of thing mothers say that is true and also slightly beside the point of what it had cost to figure it out. "Mom," Claire said. "I think I might be in a situation." A pause. "What kind of situation?" "The personal kind." Another pause. "Is he decent?" Clara thought about the café, the legal pad, the peonies, the break room, the circled number on the whiteboard. "He's decent," she said. Then be careful, her mother said. But not so careful you miss it. She hung up and sat at her new kitchen table. A real one, from an actual furniture store, bought with her own money, wide enough to spread papers across, and she watched Sophie navigate the apartment with the focused determination of a newly walking 14-month-old, and she thought about what her mother had said. Not so careful you miss it. She'd been careful for a long time. She understood why. The caution had been constructed out of real experiences, real consequences. The actual cost of trusting wrong and paying the price in ways that affected not just her but the small person currently attempting to scale the couch cushions. But caution, she'd been learning, slowly, imperfectly, across a year of learning things the hard way and the better way simultaneously. Caution was a tool, not an identity. You used it when you needed it, and you set it down when the situation changed. The situation had changed. She went to sleep at a reasonable hour for the first time in recent memory, and she slept through until Sophie woke at 6, and she lay there in the gray Lincoln Square morning light and thought that she had built something. Not perfectly, not without help, but built, with her own hands and her own stubborn refusal to accept that the life she had in November was the life she was going to have forever. That was worth something. That was worth quite a lot. Patricia sent the term sheet Friday morning at 9:15. It was 16 pages, which was thorough, and Clara read every word of it, which was standard. The funding commitment was there, structured as a 3-year pledge with the first-year disbursement on program launch. The governance structure was there, a 5-person board with Clara holding program director authority over operational decisions. The CDG branding was present but subordinate, the program named separately Second Horizon Foundation. Clara had written the name in the margin of her own memo, and apparently Patricia had noticed. Janet's name was in the draft board composition. Clara read the name twice. Then she called Patricia. He asked her last night, Patricia said, before Clara could speak. She said she'd think about it. This morning she sent me a list of questions about the financial accountability structure. A pause. I consider that a yes. Thank you, Patricia. Don't thank me. Get the red lines back to me by end of day if you have them. She had 3 red lines, small, structural, about the timeline for the second-year funding review. She sent them to Patricia by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, the term sheet had come back with 2 of her 3 red lines accepted and the third modified into something she could work with. She signed it at 2:47 p.m. She sat at her desk for a moment with the signed document on the screen, and she thought about everything it was and everything it was going to require, and all the ways it could go wrong, and all the things she'd need to learn that she didn't know yet. She thought about the 12 families the pilot would serve, the ones she hadn't met yet, who existed somewhere in Chicago right now, working 3 jobs and eating insufficient lunches and staring at numbers on a screen at 1 a.m. that looked like jokes. She sent the signed document to Patricia. Then she picked up her phone and sent a text. Signed. The reply, I know, Patricia told me. A pause. A second text. Are you done for the day at 5? She typed, yes. A longer pause. Then, there's a place on Milwaukee Avenue I've been meaning to try. Not fancy, just good. She held her phone for a moment. She typed, you're asking. The reply came in 30 seconds. I'm asking. She typed, yes. She put her phone in her bag and went back to the Second Horizon Foundation folder she'd already created on her desktop, moving fast now, the way she always moved once a decision was made, and she started building the intake framework from scratch, the real one, not the memo version. She had work to do. She always had work to do. The difference now was that some of it was hers. The restaurant on Milwaukee Avenue was, as advertised, not fancy. It had 20 tables, paper menus, and a blackboard on the wall with the specials written in someone's handwriting. It had the smell of a place that had been cooking the same things well for a long time and had no interest in changing. They ordered too much again. Clara had come to understand this was a pattern. Both of them, separately and together, operated with the unconscious abundance of people who had once not had enough and had never entirely recalibrated. She found it one of the more endearing things about him that he ordered 2 appetizers at a neighborhood restaurant on Milwaukee Avenue. She let herself find it endearing. She'd been monitoring that particular response for months, and she was done monitoring it. So, he said. So, she said. Foundation. Foundation, she agreed. How does it feel? She considered the question properly rather than defaulting to an easy answer. Terrifying, she said. And right, both at the same time, which I've learned is usually what right feels like. He nodded. He knew that feeling. She could see that he knew it. The name, he said, Second Horizon. I wrote it in the margin. I didn't know Patricia would put it in the document. Patricia puts everything in the document. He looked at her. Where did it come from? She thought about it. There's a thing that happens, she said slowly, when you've been in survival mode for a long time. You stop being able to see past the immediate problem. The horizon just disappears. You can't see far enough ahead to plan or hope or build anything. You're just managing what's in front of you. She turned her cup on the table. A second horizon is what happens when the first problem gets far enough behind you that you can see again. When the view opens back up. She paused. That's what I want the program to give people. Not rescue, just a view. He was quiet for a long moment. That's exactly right, he said. She looked at him across the table in the not-fancy restaurant on Milwaukee Avenue. This man who had started as a stranger at a window table and was now the most specific person in her life. And she thought about all the versions of this conversation she'd been afraid to have and all the reasons she'd kept not having it. And she thought that fear was a useful signal. It told you something was real, but it was a terrible reason to stop. You want to know something? She said. Yes. In the café, that day. She held his gaze. I almost didn't sit down. I know. I stood there for a full minute deciding whether to walk out. I saw you. And you just... She shook her head slightly. You just waited. You didn't push. You made the offer, and you waited. It was your decision. Most people don't understand that. She felt the weight of what she was saying and said it anyway. Most people who want to help make it about themselves. They need you to accept the help the right way, with the right amount of gratitude, on their timeline. You just put the offer on the table and let it sit. He was quiet. Something in his face had shifted into the open, unguarded expression she only ever saw when he didn't know he was being watched. He knew now. It was still there. I knew what it felt like to be pushed, he said. After Sarah died, people pushed. Good intentions, wrong approach. I learned to just say the thing and get out of the way. This was the first time he'd said her name, his wife's name. He said it carefully, the way you say a name that is precious and painful in equal measure, and Clara heard the weight of it and didn't look away from it. She sounds like she was someone worth missing, Clara said. She was. His voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. She would have liked you. She had no patience for people who performed and a lot of patience for people who worked. Clara didn't know what to do with that entirely. It settled somewhere she didn't have a name for. Olivia has her chin, he said, and her way of making her mind up about something and then being immovable about it. She decided Sophie was her person in about 45 seconds at graduation. She'd been asking to meet Sophie for 2 weeks. He looked slightly rueful. I'd been managing the timing. You'd been managing me. I'd been managing myself, he said, which was more honest than she'd expected and landed accordingly. She turned her cup again. The table between them felt different than it had in November. Less distant somehow, even though the physical dimensions were the same. I'm not easy, she said. I know. I mean it. I push back on things. I don't like being managed, which you've probably noticed. I have a 14-month-old who is currently going through a phase of believing that sleep is optional and that all household objects belong to her. She looked at him. And I'm about to spend the next year building a nonprofit from scratch while holding down a senior operations role, which means I'm going to be distracted and tired and sometimes difficult to reach. Clara, I'm serious. I know you're serious. He leaned forward slightly. I have a 5-year-old who told her kindergarten teacher that her father's girlfriend was named Clara before her father had said anything of the kind to anyone. Clara stared at him. Olivia said, last Tuesday. Apparently she's been planning the announcement for some time. He had the expression of a man who had spent a week processing this information. Her teacher told me at pickup, with significant interest. What did you say? I said that Olivia had strong opinions about most things and that I'd discuss it with her at home. He paused. At home, Olivia said she'd seen us at graduation and at Sophie's birthday, and that I looked at you the way I looked at her when she was sleeping, which is apparently her metric for the serious version of caring about someone. Clara was very still. "She's 5, she said. "She's extremely perceptive for 5. "What did you say to her?" I said she wasn't wrong. The restaurant made its quiet sounds around them. Other tables, the kitchen, someone laughing near the front. Clara looked at this man across the table from her, and she thought about walls and about what it cost to build them, and what it cost to take them down, and whether the second cost was worth it. She knew the answer. She'd been knowing it for months. "Tell Olivia," she said, "that she's not wrong." Something happened in his face, the open expression becoming more open. He didn't say anything for a moment, and she appreciated that. Appreciated that he sat with it the same way he'd sat with everything important, without rushing to fill it. "Okay," he said. Same word. Completely different weight than the first time he'd said it. She picked up her fork. "Eat," she said. "We ordered too much again." "We always order too much." "I'm aware. I'm choosing not to examine what that means about both of us." He laughed. She let herself be the reason for it. The Second Horizon Foundation launched its pilot program in February, 3 months after the term sheet was signed. The intake process that Clara had mapped in the memo was built out over those 3 months with the same systematic attention she'd brought to every project since the Pilsen files. Except this time, the system was entirely her design, her decision, her name on the program documentation. She hired a part-time intake coordinator, a woman named Grace, who had a social work background and the specific kind of calm that high-need situations required. She finalized the partnership with the University of Illinois Continuing Education Program, which turned out to be easier than she'd expected because the director of the program had spent 15 years watching students drop out due to financial pressure and had been waiting for exactly this kind of structural solution. She negotiated the childcare partnership rates using her own history with the CDG network as the baseline and pushing lower. She built the employment placement pipeline with 6 companies in the first cohort, CDG among them, but not alone, because she'd understood from the beginning that the program couldn't be a CDG recruitment tool and had written that explicitly into the governance documents. Janet, on the board, had pushed back on the employment placement timeline. 12 months was too compressed for meaningful outcome measurement, she'd said, at the first board meeting in January, with the directness Clara had hired her for. She wanted 18 months. Clara had pushed back on the pushback. 12 months was what the families could actually sustain financially. 18 months was an institutional preference, not a family preference. They'd compromised at 15 with a 6-month follow-up evaluation. Clara had driven home from that board meeting feeling the specific satisfaction of having been challenged by someone smart and having held her position with evidence. It was a different kind of satisfaction than the A on the capstone or the Pilsen memo or the senior coordinator promotion. Those had been about proving she could do something. This was about actually doing it. The 12 pilot families were enrolled by the end of February. 6 women and 6 men, all single parents, all below 200% of the federal poverty line, all with incomplete post-secondary education ranging from 1 semester to Clara's own 8-credit situation. Their backgrounds ranged across the city: Pilsen, Englewood, Rogers Park, Humboldt Park, South Shore. Some were working 2 jobs, some 3, one was working 4. Most had childcare situations that were technically functional and actually precarious. The same rickety infrastructure Clara had been managing when she walked into the Bend on a November afternoon. She read every intake file herself. That was a decision she'd made before launch and had not changed, despite Grace's reasonable argument that at scale, this wouldn't be possible. At scale, she'd told Grace they'd build a review process. For the pilot, she read every file. She sat at her kitchen table in the Lincoln Square apartment on a Sunday in late February. Sophie asleep, the apartment quiet, and she read 12 files. 12 lives laid out in intake forms with supplementary documentation, pay stubs, enrollment records, childcare receipts, the specific financial archaeology of people who had been managing on not enough for too long. She read them without professional distance. She let them cost her something. She thought that was important. Not losing the distance so much that she couldn't function, but not building so much of it that the work became abstract. These were people, not cases. The system she was building was going to touch real days in real lives, and she needed to remember what that felt like from the inside. She knew what it felt like from the inside. That was the whole point. What? The first cohort graduated from the program in the late spring of the following year. Not all 12. 9. 2 had left within the first 4 months. 1 had relocated out of state for a family situation. 1 had withdrawn after a personal crisis that Grace had documented carefully, and which Clara had followed closely enough to know that the door remained open if he wanted to return. The 3rd had extended into the 18-month track Janet had proposed, a decision that had turned out to be right for that specific family. 9 families. 9 people who, on an evening in late May, sat in a rented conference room on the near west side with their children in the audience and their completion certificates on the table in front of them, and listened to Clara Whitmore speak for the first time publicly about the day she'd stood at a counter with $1.43 and a crying baby and been told to come sit down. She'd written the speech herself and she'd rewritten it 4 times. And the 4th version was the one she'd almost not given because it was the most honest, and honesty in front of strangers in a professional setting had never been her natural register. She gave it anyway. She said, "I know what it feels like when the horizon disappears. I know the specific arithmetic of poverty, where you're not just short of money, but short of time, and short of the mental space required to plan beyond today. And how that shortness compounds into something that starts to feel like a personality rather than a circumstance." She said, "The thing that changed my situation wasn't charity. It was structure. Someone built a structure that let me use what I already had. The intelligence, the determination, the capacity, those were mine. They'd always been mine. What was missing was the architecture that let them matter." She said, "That's what we're trying to build here, not rescue, architecture." She said, "The 9 of you in this room did the work. I just made sure the building didn't fall down while you were doing it." Afterward, a man named Darnell Washington, 41, from Inglewood, single father of 2 daughters, who had completed his associate's degree in accounting and been placed with a mid-sized firm in the West Loop, came up to her with his older daughter beside him, a girl of about 12 who had the self-possessed bearing of someone who had watched her father fight for something and understood what it meant. "I want to tell you something," Darnell said. "Okay," Clara said. "The intake form asked me to describe my situation. I wrote 1 sentence. He looked at her steadily. I wrote, 'I have 2 daughters, and I want them to see me finish something.'" Clara held his gaze. "Did they?" she asked. He looked at his daughter, who was looking back at him with an expression so specific and so full that Clara had to look at the middle distance for a moment. "They did," he said. By the end of the 2nd year, Second Horizon had served 43 families across 3 Chicago neighborhoods. By the end of the 3rd, it had expanded to Milwaukee and Indianapolis, partnering with regional employers and educational institutions in each city. Clara had hired a program director for Milwaukee, a man named Tom Velez, who'd come out of the nonprofit sector with a decade of workforce development experience and the practical intelligence of someone who understood that the distance between a policy and a life was where everything either worked or it didn't. Janet remained on this board. She continued to push back at every meeting. Clara continued to be grateful for it, in the way you're grateful for the things that make your work harder, and therefore better. The coverage came, eventually, a piece in the Tribune, then a segment on a local news program, then a longer feature in a national magazine that Clara had sat for reluctantly because she'd never been comfortable with the personal narrative version of the work. She understood its utility. Stories moved people. Data didn't, or didn't in the same way. But she was careful about how the story was told, careful to keep Darnell and the 8 others who'd agreed to be named at the center of it rather than herself, careful not to let the version that became public calcify into something tidier than the truth. The truth was that it was hard work, and it didn't always work, and some families fell through the gaps that even a well-designed structure couldn't close. And she sat with those outcomes the same way she sat with the successes, with the same refusal to look away. She talked to Ethan about the hard ones. This was something she'd learned to do, not without resistance. She'd spent so long not distributing weight that the habit had grooves worn into it, but deliberately, the way you learn any skill worth having. He listened the way he always listened, without rushing to fix what didn't need fixing. And sometimes he said the thing that reoriented the problem, and sometimes he said nothing, and that was the right answer too. They had arguments. She wanted to document that, at least to herself, because the temptation in retrospect is to smooth things into a coherent arc, and the real version had edges. She pushed back on decisions he made at CDG that she thought affected their shared professional credibility differently. He pushed back on her impulse, persistent even now, to solve things alone before asking for help. There was a disagreement in their second year together about the Milwaukee expansion pace that was genuinely unresolved for 3 weeks and required a board conversation and a revised timeline before it reached anything like a landing. They were not a smooth story. They were two people with specific damage and specific strengths learning, in real time, how to be in the same life without losing the architecture of the individual selves they'd built. It was harder than either of them had managed to predict, which was also, Clara had come to believe, the only version of it worth doing. Olivia and Sophie, for their part, remained entirely uncomplicated about the whole thing. Olivia had appointed herself Sophie's de facto older sister with the same decisive authority she brought to every significant life decision, and Sophie accepted this appointment with the equanimity of someone who had always known she was owed an older sister and was glad the paperwork had finally come through. They fought, occasionally, with the specificity of siblings who know each other well enough to locate the effective pressure points. They made up with the same completeness. Watching them together, Clara sometimes felt something she couldn't entirely organize into language. A recognition that the connection between these two small people had begun in a moment of desperation at a counter in a café, that its origins were in the hardest day of one year and the best decision of another, and that the girls themselves would never know the full weight of the ground their friendship was built on. That was fine. They didn't need to know. Some foundations did their job best when no one thought about them anymore. In November of the 4th year, the anniversary month that Clara had privately tracked since the beginning, she walked into the Bend on River Street by herself in the late afternoon and ordered a meal. Not the day-old bread, a real meal. She sat at a table near the window. Not the window table, that one was occupied by someone working on a laptop with a cold coffee and a legal pad, and she smiled at the echo of it. And she ate her lunch and she watched the door. She did this every year now. Came in, ordered, watched. The specific logic was not something she could have easily explained to anyone who asked, though a few people had tried. It wasn't performance, and it wasn't ritual in any formal sense. It was more that she had a theory, built out of her own experience and confirmed over 4 years of intake files and cohort completions and conversations with families who had come through the program, that the world's distribution of hard moments was broadly indifferent to people's readiness for them. That someone, right now, somewhere in this city, was having the kind of day she'd had in this cafe 4 Novembers ago. And she couldn't fix the whole distribution. She knew that. The program was a structure, not a net. It caught some and not others, and she'd made her peace, imperfectly, with the gap. But she could buy a meal for a stranger in a cafe on a cold afternoon. She could do that specific thing as many times as she was able in as many places as she could find, and she could do it without performance, without requiring gratitude, without a ledger. She could put the offer on the table and get out of the way. The door opened. A woman came in, young, maybe 24, 25, with a tired face and a small child on her hip, and her eyes going immediately to the display case with the calculation Clara recognized from the inside. Clara watched her get in line. She watched her look at the prices. She watched the woman's shoulders make the particular adjustment that Clara had made, the recalibration toward whatever the cheapest option was, the quiet management of public exposure that had its own grammar if you knew what to read. Clara stood up. She walked to the counter. "I'm adding to her order," she told the cashier. "Whatever she wants. Add it to mine." The woman turned and looked at her, suspicious first. Clara expected that, had expected it for 4 years, considered it the correct response from someone who had learned that offers came with catches. "I don't need," the woman started. "I know," Clara said. "Come sit down." A long pause. The child on the woman's hip looked at Clara with round, unimpressed eyes. Clara waited. She didn't push. She made the offer and she stood beside it and she let it sit. The woman looked at her for a moment longer. Then, with the particular quality of someone who is too tired to sustain the refusal, she said, "Okay." They ordered. They sat. Outside on River Street, November did what November did. Indifferent, cold, the river 2 blocks north keeping its own time. Inside the bend, two strangers sat across from each other at a table by the window, and one of them ate a warm meal and the other drank hot tea she hadn't asked for. And somewhere in the city, a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old were in an after-school program teaching each other games with increasingly complicated rules. And a man on the 15th floor of a building on Wacker Drive was filling a legal pad with handwriting that tilted left. It was not a perfect life. It had never been a perfect life, and that, Clara had learned, was exactly the point. The walls she'd built had served their purpose, and the purpose was finished. The caution that had kept her safe had done its job and could now be set down, mostly in the places where setting it down was safe. The self she'd rebuilt over 4 years of early alarms and insufficient sleep and peanut butter sandwiches and legal pads full of questions. That self was hers, earned, not given, documented in grade notifications and signed term sheets and completion certificates, and the faces of people who had come through the program with their horizons returned to them. She had started with $1.43, and the knowledge that she was going to be humiliated in front of strangers. She had ended up here. Not because she'd been saved, because she'd been given a running start, and she'd run. Across the table, the young woman ate her soup. Her child reached for the bread with both hands. Clara recognized the gesture, the uncomplicated, absolute certainty of hunger being met, and she felt something in her chest that opened, as it always did in this particular place, without closing again. Outside, the city moved on. The river kept its course, and at a table by the window in a café on River Street, the smallest possible version of the work continued, one meal at a time, the only way it ever had.